is about our next steps. This is a first step in many steps in this season of transition that we've talked about. A time of searching, not just initially in searching for perhaps another minister, but a time of searching as a church, of establishing in a more deeper way who we are as a church and where we want to go as a body of Christ. And so this morning, Greg is going to be encouraging us. We're going to walk through some perspective and some principles of transition, and hopefully some encouragements on how we can, in a godly way, sort of live through this time together and to grow, to be stronger, and to be better equipped to be the Lord's servant in our community. And I'm speaking about the church. Okay, we're all servants, but the church is God's servant in this community, and that's who we are. So that's where we want to go this morning. So I want to start with a prayer, and again, so I'm encouraged, and I thank you for being here this morning. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we're grateful for your Son Jesus, who gives us life, who gives us reconciliation and relationship with you, Father. And we give thanks and praise to you this morning as being our God, the God of all creation, and the God who is our Lord and our Savior. And we thank you, Father, for your mercy, for your grace, and we just pray for our church that you will, through your Spirit, that you will lead and teach us and mold us into the likeness of your Son, Father. That is our desire, is to meet each other, to meet those around us where they're at, and to together be transformed into your likeness, Father. And we thank you for Greg, and we just pray that you will bless us in our time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Greg?
Thank you, Garth. Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. We survived another week, right? All right. I do have some handouts. I don't know if we have enough. If you're sitting together with a spouse or close friend, maybe we can share. So I'll just, if you want to start those on that side, great. And then some of the leaders had a copy from last night, and so if they want to reference those, that's fine. The copies are very, very similar, just a handful of differences, and I can point those out as we go along. Really, really excited to be with you all today. I can want to let you know that yes, it is a Saturday, and yes, we're going to take most of the morning, but I hope this will feel like it goes by quickly. Hopefully, prayerfully, the information will intrigue you, and I'm not going to be talking at you for 2.5 hours. We're going to be doing some breakout stuff, and you're going to be breaking into some smaller groups as we go through some of our material, and give you an opportunity to plumb the depths of some of our subject matter together. So I appreciate Nate helping us out with the video this morning, and we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. So one of the things I want us to start with this morning is just I want to provide a little bit of opportunity for us to dwell in the Word together and center our heads and center our hearts. So if you've got your Bible with you, please turn to John 17. And this is, of course, Jesus' great prayer of unity with the Father. And I love this passage because this is one of the few places in Scripture where Jesus is praying for us, because he prays not just for those who are currently in his entourage or part of his ministry, but for those who are going to also be on the receiving end of the ripple effect of the ministry for many, many years to come. And so I want to start reading this morning, John 17, verse 20, and we're going to read through verse 23. I'm not just praying for these also, but for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I am in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I and them, and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful passage, and I love what Jesus is praying for here, because he wants the world to see him in us. And the only way we're going to allow that to happen, or the number one way that's going to happen, is by our love for one another and being united. And interim seasons in a church can be tricky because, we talked a little bit last Sunday about sometimes when leaders transition, sheep can get a little restless sometimes. And, maybe we get to a place where we try to take things into our own hands. And this particular season is one of great prayer and great discernment. And the heart I've seen in your church as we've interacted so far is just such a sweet, blessed, faith-filled heart. And so I think this is going to be a time for you that you will not find yourselves in a situation that a lot of churches find themselves in, where they're competing and posturing and those kinds of things. So I'm really excited about that. Some of you are here this morning wondering, why exactly have I been invited to this meeting? There's nothing formal that has been decided. We are not in partnership with this church as far as the search is concerned. The elders will decide after this weekend at some point in the future if they're going to partner with us, if they're going to partner with another organization, if they're going to do something in-house. So the reason that I'm here today is just to share Interim Ministry Partners framework with you. This is what we recommend when we work with churches. And we've been doing this for about the past 10 years, and so have developed some pretty solid best practices, I think, as churches go into the interim season. But one of the things that the elders are inviting you to do today, some of you who are here, well, everyone who's here, but some of you who may potentially serve on the search committee, they're inviting you to just listen to this framework and to see if you are invited to serve, if this may indeed be a right fit for you. And so we want to marry talents and strengths and skills and those sorts of things with the various needs that we'll be talking about as we go through this material together today. Okay? So we will take some breaks, by the way, so don't worry about that. We'll give you a chance to refill coffee and grab another donut. Those are all fat-free, I think, by the way. I noticed as I looked in the box, they all look like they were really healthy, so I think we're in good shape. So first thing I want to do this morning is give you just a little bit of background information on us. And if you have a participant's guide, great. You can follow along as we go through there. So go ahead and flip on over to page 2, if you will. And you'll notice one of the first things we want to do there is just give you a chance to kind of get to know Interim Ministry Partners a little bit. And so just want to tell you a little bit about who we are and kind of how we came to be. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We've got a lot of other things that we want to get to. But the name Tim Woodruff may be familiar to some of you. I don't know. Tim is a minister in Churches of Christ. He was at the Otter Creek Church in Nashville, Tennessee for about 10 years. Wrote a book called The Church of Ice. Also did a great book on Walk This Way, a book on the Beatitudes, which is one of the best Bible study guides on the Beatitudes that I've ever seen. And there's a bunch of those out there, so it's really, really good. But Tim, when he left Otter Creek, had churches that called and said, hey, we need some help. And so he said, well, okay, sure, I'll come have a conversation with you. And that ultimately led to the creation of him doing interim ministry, which led to the creation of Interim Ministry Partners. Phil Ware, who was at the time in Abilene, Texas, and Mark Frost, who at the time was in Trenton, Michigan, and I was living in Tennessee at the time. Tim invited the three of us to come with him and join this organization. And then ultimately in 2015 at the Pepperdine Lectures, we formally launched as Interim Ministry Partners. Actually, that was back in 2013. Wow, hard to believe. But anyway, so I was with the organization full-time for about 2 years, and then an opportunity opened up for me to actually go back into full-time ministry. So when I began working with the A&M Church of Christ, I negotiated with the elders when I was hired to also continue to do some consulting. So just to kind of keep a toe in those consulting waters. And our elders have a great kingdom mindset, and they opened up the door for us to do this. So a couple other names that have worked with us in the past. Rubel Shelley might be a name you recognize. John York, possibly. I don't know. John Seibert, who is Charles Seibert's son. These may be some names that are familiar to some of you. They may not be. But the good news is that these are all individuals who are really know Churches of Christ well, know the various challenges that we face. They also are students of culture. And so as the last several years have gone by, we've been helping numerous churches, and this is the first year that we actually have had to say no to churches because there's so many churches that are in transition right now. And one of the things that we're experiencing, and I talked a little bit about this last week, is that we kind of have a trough in ministry candidates. And we've gone for many, many years where so few young men are going into preaching ministry. We had about a 25-year lull, and our Christian colleges, starting probably about a decade ago, started to take note of this, and so they funded some chairs, and they're trying to do some creative things with scholarships and that sort of stuff. But there is a void there. So churches that are seeking ministers are finding there's quite a bit of a challenge in really getting someone who is highly competent, and not only a student of the Word, but also a student of culture. And so I think we're seeing some traction, but it is creating some rather unique challenges. So that's a little bit about us. As we go through our time together this morning, I will learn more and more about you. And so I've had some great conversations with your elders, looking forward to some other follow-up conversations if God opens those doors. Kind of a theological framework for why we do what we do. And I am going to, is there a clicker for the remote so we can have the slides? Oh, back there, you got it. Okay, you're going to click. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next couple of slides. If you'll see the first one where we keep going, one more. All right, keep on going forward. I want to get to the one that talks about theology. So I want to create this morning, or share with you this morning, a theological framework that talks about why we do what we do. And this process is highly, highly deliberate. Very little is left to chance, but a lot is certainly left to faith. So if you go to the next slide, Nate, we want to talk a little bit about the theology of the Spirit. And I'm on page 2 of the handouts if you want to flip over there. If you see key words or key phrases that really jump out at you, please underline those. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask, and we'll go through and process any questions that you might have. But one of the things I want to just really point out as we begin is that the process that we use is not about references. It's not about job postings. This is a very prayer-focused, prayer-centric, Holy Spirit-guided process. We do not advertise, for example, in Christian Chronicle classified ads that we are searching for a preacher for this church. Usually what happens when something is posted somewhere, the church will get, one of the churches that I worked with recently got over 130 resumes, 130. And a lot of those folks had either been fired from their jobs or couldn't get jobs or wanted to preach but didn't really have the background that even matched the minimum qualifications that the post of the job requirements. And so it kind of takes a lot of time. And we ultimately end up, if we're not careful, with what we call the preacher parade, where, you kind of get 3 people who look like they may be the best, and you bring those 3 people in Sunday, one after the other, and then, based on one sermon on one Sunday, we decide, we really like that guy. And so it's just like a beauty pageant, and we don't want to do that either. So this takes a tremendous amount of time. In some churches, it takes about 6 months. In some churches, it takes up to 18 months. It just all depends on the church. and depends on how healthy the church is and what the church is looking for. But one of the things that we want to do for sure is we want to couch this in spiritual terms, and really, really stay prayer focused throughout the entire process, and obviously spending a lot of time in the Word as well. It's also about a theology of calling. And Jesus called his disciples to come and to follow him. And, we read great stories like in Luke 4 where, they literally leave their boats, they leave their livelihood, they leave this phenomenal catch of fish that they've just pulled out of the lake, and they lay it all aside and they go follow Jesus. And so there's two senses of calling in our framework. One is, what is the call of God on your church? What is the specific future that he is leading Pittman Road into? And once you identify that, your vision, your mission, your values, where you see God at work, then the ideal is to find someone whose head and whose heart aligns with the head and the heart of the church. So we're not hiring the individual to come and tell you where to go. You're figuring out where you're going through the power of God's Spirit, and then we find the individual who can help you move that forward. And so ultimately that person is called to come and be aligned with God's calling on this church. So again, very, very deliberate. There's also a theology of transition, and we're going to spend more time talking about this here in just a bit. But in many ways we see God working most powerfully during times of transition, and you can see on the screen up there, just from a scriptural perspective, all the different transitions that we see in Scripture, and this is just a handful, and how we see God move powerfully through those times. And so much of it has to do with how the people of God respond to what God is up to. And so it can be a really, really difficult time, even though many wonderful things happen during the period of the Judges, and God worked powerfully in the period of the Judges. What did the people ultimately want? We want a king, right? And so how'd that work out for them? Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, right? Depending on the situation. And so in seasons of transition, it's really about how do we respond. Is it really going to be about, we've got to have a preacher? Is that where we're going to be? Is that where we're going to spend most of our focus and most of our time? Or is it going to be, Lord, what do you want? Lord, how can we align our heads and our heart with your head and with your heart? And so it can be a very, very blessed time. And so we're very purposeful about transition. We're purposeful about seeing what God is doing in the midst of transition. One of the beautiful things that happens, and this is kind of serendipitous in some ways, is that members who serve on the search team together grow very close. And as they go through this process and learn how to work through processes via a theological framework, these then become also the next generation of leaders for the church. And so many of our search team members go on after the search to be ministry leaders. And that ends up being a really, really beautiful thing for the church as well. There's also a theology of vision and mission, and we talk a lot about where are you going, how are you going to get there. The simplest definition for me of vision is where you're going. It's your desired future state. Mission is how you get there, okay? So my vision when I woke up this morning was to be here to present this material this morning. That was my desired future state. The mission was Garth's Ford Escape that he loaned me over the weekend. Okay? It was the vehicle that got me here. All right? So what is your desired future state as a church? As you look out into the future, what do you see God accomplishing here? And the mission then is what's going to get you there. It's the how-to part. And so we talk a lot about that, spend a lot of time on that. And the way this generally works is the consultant, from our perspective, is working with the search team to put the healthy processes in place, but is simultaneously working with the leadership to get the healthy overarching big picture in place. And so then those two groups have got a solid partnership to base their working relationship on. A theology of communal discernment is kind of the fifth characteristic of the theological framework. And basically, this is learning how to decide together. We want to be highly, highly collaborative and not trust one person's insight. But even if one person has some brilliant insight, that insight is tested in the context of community. And so the search team works together, the eldership works together, and we learn how to decide together. And it's a beautiful thing to see take place. Recently, we finished one of our searches, and I was in the meeting, and one of the elders literally could not talk. He was so choked up. And he just said, the way that you guys have worked together. He said, I've never seen anything like it in my 40 years at this church. And so those are the kind of feedback pieces that really bless us. So let's talk a little bit about process basics. If you'll go ahead and flip over to page 3. And give you just a little bit of insight here into kind of what interim ministry has looked like in churches of Christ. So first generation model of interim ministry was kind of based on what we would call big personalities and big churches, and really the focus was on what took place in the context of the assembly. And we had some wonderful people many years ago who launched out into interim ministry. Jerry Barber is a great example. I don't know if that name rings a bell with anyone. He's primarily spent most of his ministry years in Tennessee and Alabama. But Jerry would be a guy who was well known, would come in and literally live at a church for 6, 7, 8 months and help that church. Tim Woodruff's father, Jim Woodruff, did similar things. Would come in and help a church for a season. But in those kinds of scenarios, generally it was about we get someone in here to kind of take care of the preaching and to love on the church. And the newer models that we're seeing, and a lot of this has to do with work that's being done by the Cybert Institute out of Abilene Christian University, Hope Network, Interim Ministry Partners, which is a subdivision of Hope Network, much more intentionality. And so the desire to be about consistent pulpit presence. And by that we mean we're not just doing the rotating, someone different preaches every Sunday and they preach whatever feels right to them. I've been thinking about Mark 9, and I think I'd like to do a sermon out of Mark 9. And the next guy says, well, I'm kind of more of a topical guy, so I think I want to do a sermon on healthy marriages. And then the next guy says, well, you know what, I want to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So consistent pulpit presence really is about making sure that what's coming out of the pulpit matches what's happening thematically in our elders' dialogue and in our search team dialogue as we're working through the stages of interim. The church is being fed and the vocabulary is being developed so that hopefully, prayerfully, we're all on the same page. Okay? And so there's a couple of different things that we do. We sometimes will come in and work with congregations where we oversee the search process, and we also do the preaching. And we'll usually teach a Bible class as well. There are other churches that we work with, and again, this is just kind of totally up to the leadership, where we come in once a month and we preach one Sunday a month, and then we identify a partner to work with on the preaching side on the Sundays that we are not here. So many different ways, as we say in the South, to skin that cat. But the ideal is just to be highly consistent with our approach. Also, we are in a consulting relationship that is focused on the church, the needs of the church, and then it's about search process, literally working through all of the steps of the search process. And when we get a little closer to the end of our time, I'll walk you through step by step the framework of our search process. So do you see the difference in how we kind of used to do interim ministry and what the newer focus looks like? It's just much more strategic and much more purposeful in its approach. And so far, we're seeing some good stuff there. So I want to talk now a little bit about opportunities of the interim season and how exciting this time can be as we really see God at work. And, I don't want to come across as so Pollyanna that we don't recognize that there are also a lot of great challenges of the interim season. But there are some wonderful things that can happen. And notice in your handout here on page 3, first of all, a transitioning church, an incredible opportunity just to celebrate what God has done through your church. So, as you look back over the past and you just think, wow, the lives that have been impacted and where we see God at work and we just have a lot to celebrate as we think about the past and as we look forward to the future. A transitioning church is also motivated to do the hard work of listening to God, hearing His call, discerning His will for the church. And so you see the language here, the theological framework language that we just talked about, right? And we've got opportunity to really together as a church to be in the Word together and to be praying together and to be processing together. Very beautiful time. We can also clarify mission, and you have a mission statement. I know you do because I saw it on your bulletin and saw it on your website. And it's meet Jesus and what? Meet others where they are and together be transformed into the likeness of Christ. Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. I was close. I started out with the meat part, so that was good. So we'll talk, and it gives you as a church opportunity in the interim season to really own that mission and then find out whose head and heart aligns with that from a preaching candidate perspective. Sometimes when we lose a preaching minister, it does expose, possibly highlights opportunities for congregational leadership. I don't know about you, Dan, in your journey here, but I know that what my job description says and what I actually do aren't always the same thing. Right? And so there's this thing called institutional knowledge that when people go through transitions, sometimes we wake up and go, hey, who's in charge of that? And it was something that you had just been doing out of the kindness of your heart or whatever. And so we can't plan for every contingency when we experience transition. And so it gives us opportunity for some aha moments that, we've got to raise some other folks up to fill those gaps or whatever it might be. Transitioning churches are more willing to recognize and address church culture issues. And so, for example, the survey that we took was just kind of a smaller version of a much, much more comprehensive survey that may allow us opportunity to really see some things that are either A, holding us back, or B, some things that are doors that are opening to really push us forward. And so it can be a great opportunity to kind of see our positives and our negatives and what we can do with that in this interim season. One of the things that's fascinating to note, and I'm down here on this idea of personal issues, transitioning churches are more willing to deal with the hard personal and interpersonal issues that accumulate over time. Do you have people here that you disagree with? Please don't yell out names. Do you have people here who sometimes challenge you and test you? Once again, please don't shout out names. That is natural. That is normal. Okay? You cannot be in relationship with other people and not sometimes stumble and sometimes grumble. That's just the nature of reality. As I said last Sunday, I don't get along with myself half the time. And so it's difficult when we're in community to sometimes get along. And just to actually show you, I'll give you a quick formula if you just want to jot this down. If you will take a number and multiply that number times itself, so we'll use simple numbers. We'll use the number 2. So if you take the number 2 and you multiply that number by itself, so 2 times 2 equals 4, and then that same number, subtract it. So 2 times 2 is 4 minus 2 equals 2, right? So in a relationship, that is the number of conflict possibilities that you have. So person A can be conflicted with person B. Person B can be conflicted with person A. Okay? So let's talk now about 4 people. 4 times 4 is 16. Minus 4 is 12. So with 4 people, you have 12 conflict possibilities 24 hours a day. Okay? Person A can, 1 can be conflicted with 2, 2 can be conflicted with 3, 3 can be conflicted with 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, how big is your church? Let's just use 200. I know you're larger than that, but let's just say 200 for sake of easy math. 200 times 200 is, math majors help me. 4,000? All right. Is it 4,000 or is it 40,000? 40,000. It's Saturday morning. It's still early. It's all good. So what's 40,000 minus 200? 39.8. So you have 39,800 conflict possibilities in your church on any given day. Okay? Now, that's not counting subgroups being in conflict with other subgroups. That's just individual conflict possibilities. Okay? So now do you understand sometimes why it's so easy for something to go wrong? Or for someone to get their feelings hurt? Or for a pain point to jump out and a cry for help to come? And so when we're in the season of interim, we've got opportunities to understand, is this something that you're really, really upset about? Or are you just feeling the pain of the interim season? Or is something else going on? Dan, I'll tell you a funny story. I had a lady one time at the end of an assembly. I preached that Sunday morning, and she walked out the back door, and she said, "That was the worst sermon I ever heard." Those are her exact words. And I was like, "Oh, wow. Well, you're the first person who's told me that today." Can we have an opportunity to have some more conversation about that later this week? And she said, "Yes, I definitely want to talk to you." Kind of I'm going to straighten you out kind of thing. And so what was fascinating was I went over to her house and we had a chance to chat. And her husband had just passed away about 9 months prior. And guess what types of sermons her husband loved the most? Sermons that really, really were heavy on Scripture. Heavy on Scripture. And that particular Sunday morning, I'd preached more of a topical sermon. And so it wasn't really about me. It wasn't really about my sermon. She was just really, really hurting. She was so lonely. Missed her husband so badly. And what's fascinating was that lady and I, she was in her 70s at the time, we became very close friends. And when I left that church to go to another work, she just hugged my neck, So a lot of times when we hear pain represented in the system, it's easy for us, if I punch you, what's your natural inclination? Punch me back. And the same thing's true verbally. If I punch you verbally, your natural inclination is to punch me back. But one of the things that we can do in interim is not punch back. We should do that all the time, but especially in interim. Tell me more. What's that about? That's interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. Can we pray about this? Give me some more insight. Give me some more information. And so God opens those doors during times of great transition. And we can really also use this as a time to focus on ministries that really, really matter. Notice this bullet list here, kind of toward the bottom of the page, the call of God on your church and on the life of your ministry staff. Where do we see the Spirit at work? We can talk about leadership and kind of take leadership inventory, how ministers and elders are going to work together. I'm trying so hard in the churches that I work with to encourage elderships to get away from the ministry staff works for us. I'm trying to eradicate that language that the ministry staff works with us. And I'm trying so hard to help elders give ministers a seat at the table. To think of elder as boss is not even a biblical model. Elders are servants, first and foremost. So it's really upside down based on worldly structures and worldly metrics. The role of spiritual gifts and are we a church that's going to be mission focused or not? We can also look at church systems, and this is fascinating. I'll show you a couple of cognitive maps here in a little while that'll get us into some church systems. And also listening to your neighbors. One of the things that we propose is called a community assessment. And so we actually set up interviews with city council members and the mayor or city manager, however you're structured here, chief of police, fire chief, superintendent of schools, principals of high schools, middle schools. And we literally go to these folks and say, hey, we are so-and-so with the Pittman Road Church. We're getting ready to hire our next preaching minister, and we would love to know, well, what are some of your pain points? And if you were going to have a church that helped you in any way, what would be the best way that church could help you? And it's fascinating the conversations that open up. And it's also fascinating the number of people that you walk in and you sit down with who start the meeting like this. And by the time it's over, you've made a friend. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see it happen. So that's one of the ways that we listen to our neighbors. But we also actually go and talk to other churches in town, especially if there's a church that's growing. And we just go and ask, hey, what are you guys doing? How are you reaching that neighborhood? And we see that you've experienced some growth. What's going on? What's God doing to to allow you to reach a demographic that we're struggling to reach. And that also creates some wonderful conversations. And then ultimately we find the new family to come and be a part of your future. And that can be a really, really blessed time. So those are some of the opportunities of the interim season. You probably already feel like you're drinking from a fire hydrant. And so I just want to stop and see, do you have any questions based on what we've shared so far? Are you with me so far? All right, very good. Very good. Well, go ahead and flip on over to page 4, if you will. And let's talk a little bit about interim ministry principles. The way that we approach, and again, I'm just giving you our framework. It is a framework. It is not the framework. It's still a work in progress. And so we present this material with a lot of humility because we're learning every single time we work with a church, something we can do better, something we can do differently. But here's some of the best practices that we've learned or some of the principles that we try to engage churches to consider. And the first is that we are about the church first, and then we are about candidates. Many times in a search process, we want to just get the job description hammered out, and we want to start promoting. We need a minister, and we start advertising, and we really don't learn much about us first. So we do very intensive survey work, very intensive focus group work. We want to identify where the pain points are, where the pinches are. What anxiety-provoking events that still have residual emotional impact on us that we haven't dealt with yet. So it's really church-heavy, and then we go find the individual whose head and heart align with the head and heart of the church. There's a tremendous amount of reliance on the search team. And so once the search team is formed, we put together this really nice little brochure that describes each search team's faith journey or why they're excited about being on the search team or some of their favorite hobbies and that kind of thing. We want to publish email addresses and give people an opportunity to know who the search team is. The search team will be visible. They'll be vocal through the process. We also want to look at quality rather than quantity. In our searches, generally, we start with, once we get the committee formed and reach out to recommenders, and I'll tell you more about that later, we usually look at about 12 candidates, sometimes as many as 15, but that's about it. And so out of that small pool comes that one high-quality candidate that is ultimately the one that we believe God will call to your church. It's highly relational. Our search process is very, very relational. We spend a lot of time with the search team, a lot of time with the shepherds, a lot of time with the staff, and even the search process itself. The members of the search team build relationships with these candidates over time. And one of the things that's really cool is the candidate pool, you may not find, some of these guys may not become a candidate at all over time. They may withdraw their name, or you may say, hey, you're just not the right fit for us. But because the relationships are so developed, they're so deep as the process unfolds, that person may come back and do a marriage weekend for you, or may come back and do a retreat, or come and speak at a special assembly. I don't know, but we keep a lot of great relationships with the candidates, even though we may say no, or even though they may say no. So it's a pretty cool deal, the way it works out relationally. And then finally, one candidate is recommended. And so the search team does their work, and they come to the leaders and they say, we believe this is the individual God is calling to be our next preaching minister or lead minister or whatever terminology that you use to describe the position that you're trying to fill. And so they don't bring two candidates. And I've been in a situation where a search team did that, and the elders said, remember the rules. You're supposed to bring us one. Go back and bring us one, not two. And so the search team is the recommendation committee, okay? The elders are the hiring committee. The elders will ultimately vet the candidate in the same manner that the search team vetted the candidate, okay? But they are going to lean heavily on and rely heavily on the candidate, the search team's recommendation of their top candidate. The minister still can come in, meet the church, preach, teach, all that kind of stuff. And so it's not like the church will meet him the very first Sunday when it's his first official sermon, okay? So there's a tremendous amount of interaction, but it does come down to one candidate, and we have found that this works extremely well. So that's just basically some of the principles. I'm going to give you many more nuts and bolts in just a little while. But let me share with you a cognitive map that you see there on the bottom of page 4 that will really provide some insight into why we do what we do. So this is called a role renegotiation model. Has anybody ever seen this before? Okay, you've seen this? Fantastic, Andy. This was developed by Dr. John Sherwood. Actually, it's been around since the 1950s. But this is one of those cognitive maps and a decision-making process that, for whatever reason, just didn't get a lot of attention in a lot of circles. And I mourn that personally because it's one of the best decision-making models that I've ever seen. And it really is about how we live in relationship with each other. So Dr. Sherwood developed this for individuals and organizations who want to be in long-term relationship. Okay? So in a marriage, do you want to be in a long-term relationship? I hope so. So this model applies very well. If you meet someone who doesn't know Jesus, but they want to know more about the church and there's a conversion experience, do we want them to be part of our church for a long, long time? Well, of course we do. Businesses want customers for life, right? So for example, if you take a hammer back to Lowe's, they're not going to argue with you at the customer service counter about that hammer. They're going to realize that the average American over his or her lifetime is going to spend probably $80,000, $90,000 on their home. So a $7 hammer is not a big deal. Okay? So they have an expectation about what's important and what's not on price points because we want customers for life. So in our case, as a church, we want to be in relationship with people for many, many years. And so what this model allows us to do is to clarify expectations. As you're getting ready to go into this interim season, it's going to last for a while, 6 months, 9 months, 18 months. I don't know how long it'll take you. I have no idea. But it's so incredibly important that we clarify expectations or negotiate roles so that we have a healthy relationship moving forward. So you'll notice at the top, one of the first things that happens is that we go through an information gathering phase. And that's what we're doing this weekend. You're learning about us. We're learning about you. At some point, we may agree to work together, or we may not. If we look at this in the marriage relationship, this would be the dating phase. You're learning about this person that you're falling in love with, and they're learning about you, and you're clarifying expectations. During this phase, when we're gathering information about one another and when we're creating expectations with one another, we're formalizing some of those expectations, but we also have very informal expectations that are developing as well. So I am here this weekend formally, okay? Your church is paying me to be here. I want to let you know, though, that Interim Ministry Partners believes so highly in the importance of what you are doing. We are buying the airfare because we really, really know that you are a critical, strategically placed kingdom outpost in this context. So we want to really partner with you in this. So we have a formal expectation that we're doing business together, okay? There are also informal expectations that develop. So, for example, when you were dating, my hunch is, men, many times you would open the door for your girlfriend at the time, okay? But my hunch is you didn't codify that in a contract. When we go out on dates, you will open the door for me, sign and date here, okay? It just became an informal expectation. And then you got married, and at some point you stopped opening the door for her. So at that point we have what's called a broken expectation, and I'll talk more about that here in just a sec. But we do this all the time. When a new member comes into your doors for the first time, they are gathering information about you. When they go on your website, they're gathering information about you. As a church, you have informal expectations. This is how we dress. You probably don't have a dress code published somewhere, right? And so you have people in jeans, and you have people in suits, and you have people all points in between, right? So those are just kind of some informal expectations. But you also have formal expectations. So, you have, this is the way we do baptisms. We've stated this. This is how we share communion together. We have articulated this. It's a formal expectation we have of people who are part of our body. So at some point, we've gathered enough information, we move to making a commitment. So if I look at the dating analogy again, we've dated and we've asked, will you marry me? And the other person said, I will, or I do. And so at that point, the relationship has been formalized. If someone comes here and they are baptized, they've made a commitment, right? To be in relationship long-term with Jesus, to be in relationship long-term with the church. So this is the I do phase. And the commitment is based on the expectations. Do you love me? Yes. Oh, I love you too. Do you want to get married and live the rest of our lives together? Yes, we're committed to one another at this point. And you'll notice what happens is that moves us to a season of, once we've made the commitment of stability and productivity, in the marriage relationship, this would be called the what period? The honeymoon period, right? And in a very, very healthy marriage, we have about 18 months or so before we have our first major disagreement. In unhealthy relationships, it takes anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months before we have our first major disagreement. But stability and productivity is a good place. It's a comfortable place. It's a place we enjoy. We don't like it when things are unstable. We don't like it when we're not getting a lot of things done. But it's a good place to be. And so what happens next, and Sherwood, this was fascinating insight, and that word actually is pinch. It's not P-I-N-C and then just a H by itself. It's actually pinch. It looks like the PowerPoint condensed it there. It's 100% predictable. This cannot not happen. You are going to have a broken expectation. And so what I thought you were going to do for me, you're not doing. Or what you thought I was going to do for you, I'm not doing. And I got pinched. And that's the definition of a pinch. A pinch is a broken expectation. Okay? Pinches hurt, right? If you don't believe me, pinch the person beside you. You will get a response, right? So pinches hurt. And in organizations, pinches happen all the time. So somebody walks in on a Sunday morning, and for 40 years, the communion table has been at the front, and they walk in on a Sunday morning, and it's not there anymore. It's been moved to the foyer. And people say, wait a minute, what happened? Who moved the communion table? Right? So we had had an expectation. It was never formalized. It wasn't codified. We will always have the communion table placed directly, 9 inches from the lip of the stage. All church members, please sign on here on the dotted line. So it became an informal expectation over time, right? The podium that my grandfather built. What do you mean we're getting rid of that? Okay. By the way, I'm just making up hypotheticals. I'm not talking to you, all right? Just hypotheticals, because these are some of the things that we hear in some of the churches that we work with. And so we have pinches. It happens all the time. Now, when we get pinched, there's basically 3 different pathways that we can take. One is called a quick fix. We quick fix all the time in organizations, okay? You do it in your family. Mom, you said you'd be here to pick me up. It's 4:05. You said you'd be here at 4. Oh, my goodness, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I got distracted. I'll be right there, okay? You're there by 4:10. You pick her up. You get home. Everything's back to normal, okay? We quick fix all the time, every day, hundreds of times a day. What we want to do as an organization is to plan renegotiation, and that's kind of the right side of the loop. As you're looking at the screen up here, the right side of the loop. And basically what that means is, if we go all the way back up here to this information gathering, if we go to this phase, what we're going to decide is, we're going to decide as a body how we're going to handle our pinches before our pinches occur. Okay? So what strategies are you going to use to talk to one another when you get pinched? What are you going to agree on as a church? If I get pinched, the first thing I'm going to do is what? Are you going to talk to a shepherd? Are you going to talk to the person who pinched you? That sounds kind of Matthew 18-ish, right? Are you going to gossip? Are you going to take your toys and go home? You know, what are you going to do? The ideal is this is how we handle our pinches around here. This is how we handle our broken expectations. And we share that information with newcomers. We share that information with the church. We talk about it openly and honestly. This is how we deal with our broken expectations. Because if you don't deal with your pinches, guess what? Your pinches will deal with you, right? And that moves us to what Sherwood described as a disruption of expectations. Now, if we don't, when we have a disruption of expectations, if we don't deal with those, and if we don't push those back up to agreements that we've made or quick fixes, then we, by default, will move to what Sherwood refers to as a crunch. And here's the definition of a crunch. A crunch is a series of stacked pinches. A series of stacked pinches. Any kind of pinch. A series of stacked pinches. S-T-A-C-K-E-D. So if you think about it, broken expectation after broken expectation after broken expectation. Have you ever seen anybody say, I have had it up to here? You ever seen anybody say that? Okay, what does that mean? I got pinched, I got pinched, I got pinched, I got pinched. I am tired of getting pinched. If I get pinched one more time, I'm going to sock somebody in the nose, okay? All right. And so we're now in a crunch. We've had so many pinches, it's like we've got this pinch pancake, okay? And I've had all I can take. And so what happens when we're in a crunch, we can go about one of four directions. One is to do what the French called, and boy, I hope I'm not about to butcher this, Garth and Diane. It's a word called ennui. And it basically means resigned to a stuck state. I'm just existing. My body is here, but my mind is not. My body is here, but my heart is not. Okay? So it's kind of, you see the arrows, it's kind of like two forces kind of pushing in. Am I right on the word? Oh, okay, good. Very good, very good. All right, fantastic. That's great. That 1 year of French I had in high school is finally paying off now, so that's really good. But you know, we know people like that, right? They kind of, their bodies are kind of here, but that's about all of them that's here. And again, please don't yell out names. That would be embarrassing. But it's okay to think about people because we want to pray for folks and we want to love on them. Silent termination is another way that people deal with their crunches. And it's called silent termination because we don't learn anything. So a family who's been part of your church for 20 years, they just stop showing up. And 4 or 5 weeks pass and somebody says, hey, what's up with so-and-so? I haven't seen them in weeks. I don't know. And so you give them a call. And, hey, where you guys been? Well, you know, it's we a lot going on, and we're really kind of busy. And so we've been traveling some. And so, yeah. Is everything okay? Oh, yeah, everything's fine. You guys coming back? I don't know. Yeah, I can look around a little bit. So in a conversation like that, what do you learn? Nothing. You don't learn anything. And they're not learning anything either, right? It's just things are kind of not going well, or they've been pinched or whatever, or they perceive they've been pinched and they just kind of do their own thing. And so people leave and the organization doesn't learn anything, and folks who leave don't learn anything. And that can actually be quite devastating. We can recommit, coming out of a crunch, we can recommit right here. But what is the problem of recommitting to your original expectations? You see it? You see an issue? Yeah, it's just going to do the same thing because you're recommitting to what didn't work right in the first place. Yeah, you didn't really address the pinch. Exactly. You just said, I'll try to do better. It's the prayer of, God, if you will get me out of this, I will never do this again. And that usually lasts about 2 weeks, right? Or shorter or longer, depending on what's going on. Not to say that it can't ever happen, because sometimes we can recommit and it can work. But generally speaking, we get back into the same habits and the same patterns. We can renegotiate up at the top, but that is under a lot of stress right here, because we haven't really dealt with the pain and the emotion in the system. And then the final is kind of planned termination, and it's basically, hey, this just isn't working. So it's the organization that lets someone go, or It is the marriage relationship that is literally so toxic that it can't be restored. And so we walk alongside people to help them separate and do as minimal damage as possible. It's the church member that refuses to stop being a troublemaker. And so we have to take action and say, you know what, this just really isn't the church for you. And so those are hard conversations. They're very difficult conversations, but at least they can be constructive and, not cause quite as much damage in the body. So let me stop talking at this point, and let you turn and talk to one another. I'm going to give you just 2 or 3 minutes here. And if you see any aha moments as you think about this model, and also I'd like for you to decide and talk a little bit about, do you as a church typically operate on this side, or do you typically operate on this side? Okay? And I'm just talking about kind of how you make decisions and how you clarify expectations and those kinds of things. Not trying to vilify anybody or throw anybody under the bus. Just have a little open dialogue about how we kind of do life together, okay? So take a few minutes and talk about this amongst yourselves, and we'll gather some of your responses.
Isn't here. She's streaming this because they're getting ready to go to Virginia for soccer.
Okay,
tournament.
okay.
But she has a question. I'm not going to answer it for her. Yeah, he's streaming it, so she's watching it at home.
What do you do with the crunch?
What do you do with it? How do you? You didn't give a positive.
Oh, okay. Good question.
How do we?
Good question.
Through that?
Okay, I'll address it. I'll come back to that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, everybody, I'm going to break in if I can. Wonderful conversation, great, robust dialogue that I'm picking up on, and want to share some of your thoughts here in just a sec with the whole group if you're willing to do that. One of the questions that was asked was, if we are in a crunch, how do we get out of it? And if you're in a crunch, how do you get out of it? And basically, it starts by going back up and getting the parties together that are in conflict with one another and asking, what did we agree on in the beginning of this relationship? And so re-clarifying expectations at that point is just going to be so critical. Depending on the severity of the disagreement, the parties who are at odds may not be able to solve it themselves. They may have to have a third party present. So in the context of the church, it could be an elder may need to be present, or a staff person might need to be present to kind of make sure that the dialogue remains civil and working on, again, re-clarifying those expectations. But the idea is we're kind of backing out of the crunch. What got us into it, so let's back out of it and bring it back over into healthy dialogue versus just finger pointing and creating a shouting match with each other. So what were some of the things that you talked about? Any aha moments? Mm-hmm.
Starting with prayer.
Right.
And the theology of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
To me, it was kind of like, wow, not an indictment on us, but just, wow, that's where we should be.
Surely.
And where we should always be.
Right.
In regards to, dealing with, this model here. I think, my opinion, I think as a church, I think we are on the planning side of
Okay.
side of the model.
Good.
But we can use more of the theology of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Kind of like what we can do.
Yeah. Think about it in terms of our relationship with the Lord. Does God want to be in long-term relationship with us? Well, of course He does. He wants us to be in long-term relationship with Him. Has God clarified expectations? He's been pretty clear. This is what I expect of you, right? In this relationship that we're in. What happens when we break expectations? When we break God's expectations? And we can get ourselves in a crunch pretty quickly, right? So, yes, sir. Andy.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
You know how some people, you use the dating model and the marriage model.
Uh-huh.
People date, they date for years, then they're engaged for years, and it takes them a long time to finally get to the point of getting married.
Right.
In a transition situation, what's the right balance between making sure you gather sufficient information and involve as many people as you want as is necessary,
Right.
so that everybody has a good understanding of where we're going, and then make the right choices?
Yeah.
Versus kind of getting stuck in that process for so long that you never move forward.
Right. You get into analysis paralysis, as we call it, right? So, yeah, were you going to... Yeah, he was talking about, and sometimes it's easy in relationships to get stuck in certain stages. So we may date for 2 or 3 years and then, be engaged for 2 or 3 years. And it takes a long time sometimes to get there. So in the context of transition in the church, how do you strike that proper balance between analyzing and, seasons of prayer and those kinds of things, and then ultimately making commitment? And I think it goes back to the communal discernment piece, that since it is a collective that is moving through, we're able to say, okay, we're ready to move from phase 1 to phase 2 and from phase 2 to phase 3. I think, though, so much of it has to do with the chairperson who is selected to really chair the search team, a strong leader, not a bull in a china shop leader, but a strong leader who is able to keep the group on target. And so even in the context of a meeting, if someone starts to chase rabbit trails, the astute leader will say, okay, guys, wonderful, loving these stories, but that's not the purpose of why we're together today. So you're kind of reminding people of the expectations. In our case, we also kind of keep a finger on the pulse of where we're going, because even the committees a committee can sometimes start chasing a rabbit trail. Well, this ministry is broken, and we need to spend some time talking about that. No, that's not your job. That's somebody else's job. So I'm a big fan of, I use the word champion a lot. And so, who's championing your mission? who's championing your vision, who's holding the leadership accountable to the expectations that we've made and making sure that we're living into that. Same thing will be true for the search process. Who's your champion that's keeping a finger on the pulse of your pace? Yeah. So what else? What else? Anything else that kind of got your attention, or any aha moments, or yes? Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Sure. Mhm. Yeah. 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 It probably is a both end. And in organizations, it's impossible to plan for every contingency, right? It's impossible. And you also have so many individual life circumstances. An individual may be on the left side, right? And even if the church is healthy, the individual may not necessarily be healthy. But what we want to try to be about is examining our systems, and are we being clear with people with our expectations? So for example, if you have someone who comes and they become part of this church family, do you tell them, this is what we expect of you? We expect you to be involved in at least one ministry. We expect you to be a part of a life group. We expect you to give. We expect you to serve, and spell out how that happens. Or are we more loosely, is our vocabulary looser, and we say, we're so glad you're here. We hope you get involved. So do you hear the difference between clear expectations? And one of the things that John Savage, who for years was a part of a group that did a lot of research on why people leave churches. Dr. Savage is now retired. But one of the things that he noted when he looked at this model was fuzzy expectations equals fuzzy commitment. And clear expectations equals clear commitment. And so, I look, for example, at the Mormons, and I think their theology is really screwy, but they're committed, and their expectations are very clear, and they don't apologize for their expectations. And they outnumber, as far as members are concerned, churches of Christ. They're over like 5 million adherents. So about 3 times as many folks as we have, almost, in our fellowship. So, when you identify who you are as a church and you identify your expectations, you're actually blessing people who come in and just being clear, hey, this is who we are. These are the things that we value, going back to your observation earlier. And we don't apologize for that. And we really believe this is what God is calling us to be and who He's calling us to be. And, when you're coming in and thinking about being a part of our family, these are some things that we expect you to commit to. And the opposite is true. We're also committing these things to you. This is what you can expect from us. If you're hurting and you call the church office, you can expect somebody's going to come spend some time with you. If you're going in for a hospital for surgery, you can expect somebody's going to come and pray with you, right? If you let us know. Yeah. Yeah.
Start searching.
Right.
And we have to get committed. The question is, how do we get, and I understand you're going to be working with the search committee doing that, but how do you get the body to, I don't want to use the word buy-in, but how do you get them committed
Yeah.
to this thinking that's not going to be involved in the search committee, but for all of us to get on board with what expectations there are? Because that's great if you have that with the committee, but
Correct.
if the rest of the body is not on board, it's not going to succeed either.
Yeah.
Because once you get a guy here, you want to move forward.
Yes.
So I guess.
Yeah.
Is there a process?
There is. The consistent pulpit presence is really the key, because whether that's something that in our case, IMP is doing directly, or if we're partnering with somebody who is going to be in the preaching and teaching. That's where it starts. That's where it takes the most root, because you're able to move the congregation at the same time that you're moving the search committee and the leaders, and you're creating a shared vocabulary so that the church doesn't feel like it's on the outside looking in. Okay. There's also a lot of information that's printed for the church to consume. We also utilize a very purposeful structure related to frequency of announcements, for example. So at a minimum, every 2 weeks, the church is updated. This is where we are in the process, okay? Publish a lot of information about links on our website and those kinds of things. But the number one thing is the consistent pulpit presence, and it's just so incredibly important. There's also focus groups that we can form, the survey. When the church takes the survey, then 4 or 5 weeks later, the information in the survey is given back to the church, which is a way to say, we heard you. This is what you've told us. We ultimately print what's called a position profile, and it literally describes the church and the community and the candidate that we're looking for. That also goes back to the church. And church, this is what you have told us, and you have an opportunity to build that rapport. So there's 4 or 5 different mechanisms to keep the church engaged. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Because the expectations are clear, right? And so we want to try to do that on the front end for sure. Well, I want to encourage you to continue thinking through. Yeah, did you have an conversation now? Surely.
You said, I think that, well, going back to the theology of vision and mission, if you don't know who you are, you can't know what you need.
Yeah,
But it's not the search committee's job to determine
that's
what
correct.
you need.
That's correct. It's the elders, the eldership and staff, and any other individuals that they invite to come in and be part of a vision team, to champion kind of moving vision and mission forward. So yeah.
So that's a process that takes place.
Right.
And I think it may address somewhat what you were saying, the idea that, there's a church-wide and leadership process of determining who we are.
Correct.
That then determines who you need.
Yes.
The search committee just takes that has been determined.
Correct.
And goes looking
Mm-hmm.
for the person that fits.
Who aligns with that vision and mission. Correct. Yeah, yeah. I use the search team a lot as first sounding boards. So for example, if there is a reiteration of vision or mission, a lot of times I will go to the search team first with the elders and say, hey, here's what's being articulated. How does that register? And it creates a good feedback mechanism. But you're right, they're not leading the charge on that. That's up to the shepherds. Yeah, for sure.
I also like the part that you said about determine who we are and where we're going, and then hire somebody to help us get there.
Yeah.
Instead of having them come in and tell them
Right.
what we are. But what I don't know is, can you give me some examples of what we're looking like? Can you give me some examples of what that would look like? Like,
So I'll use.
in other words, where would we be going? Give me some destination. Kind of like abstract to me.
Right. So let's take your current mission statement, and we'll just use it as an example. Tell me, spell out the mission statement for me one more time. Meet others where they are.
And together be transformed into the image of Christ.
Okay, and together be transformed into the image of Christ. Okay, so 3 primary movements in that definition. So meet others where they are. So what does that look like as for you as a church? What does that look like lived out behaviorally? What does that mean? Meet others where they are. Be very inviting. Okay. Got to be in the community so you can actually meet people. Open-minded. Okay, and you could even drill it down to some specifics, right? As part of being a church that meets people where they are, we are going to talk as a body about how we greet newcomers. And we're going to talk about strategic ways that we use the Welcome Center to not just meet people, but to also create opportunities to pray with people. Or to look at how we structure our worship gatherings to invite people to come to lunch once a month or once every other month. So that starts getting into some specifics that you can quantify and qualify as you look out into the future, right?
So we would explain to the new candidate.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?
You're
Can you
good.
hear me? Oh, it's on. In other words, so we would determine these things, and then when we interview a candidate, we would say, listen, we're going to try to do these things right here, and that's what we would want to hire you to do.
Yeah, not necessarily getting into the minutia with the candidate. So if you really want to be a church that meets people where they are, then you're going to want to hire a candidate who has really got a phenomenal ability to interact well with people, right? You're not going to hire somebody who's going to go sit in his office and stare at a computer screen, 40 hours a week. You'll want someone who is really relational and someone who has got a proven track record of dealing with people of disparate socioeconomic levels and has background with multiple minority groups or whomever it might be. Does that make sense? You're really looking at the person whose head and heart aligns with the head and the heart of the church.
Kind of. I'll process it.
Let me go a little further. I think this will make more sense when we get into some of the nuts and the bolts stuff a little bit later on, but hang on to that question, and if I don't answer it sufficiently enough, we'll come back around to it. But I think it'll make more sense when we get into some of the nuts and bolts stuff. Keep thinking about this role renegotiation model. How are you going to deal with your pinches? How are you going to deal with your pinches? And as you go into this interim season and beyond, it's so important that the church knows that. And we even use this language in our church office. I will have many times our office manager at the church will come in and she'll say, hey, you got a few minutes? And I'm like, sure. And she says, okay, got a pinch we got to deal with. And so it's actually become part of our vocabulary, and we're able to understand, okay, it's a broken expectation. How are we going to handle that? Okay, good.
But it also brought us to another point. So for those of us who are committed and who are loyal and are ready to do this solution, some of us we feel are, I definitely agree with Mallory, we're on the left side of the body is. But we find ourselves, yes, we have dealt with people who are in the silent termination and they've left us. But we're kind of here still mourning the loss because A, we didn't know that they left us.
Right.
But we're still stuck in it. We're still committed to the church, but we're still mourning this loss. Like some people have left, there was no goodbye. So we're kind of still loyal, and we've dealt with the silent termination, but what's the word for those of us who are like, we're still kind of mourning this loss?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And I didn't pay her for that segue, by the way, but it sets up beautifully where we're going to go next. So hang on to that. No, did you have an observation? Okay. Were you going to make an observation?
I did, but I also don't want to miss it.
Oh, you guys are so kind. You're so kind. Hang on to it, and let's go a little bit further, and then we'll take our first break in the morning, and we can also talk about some of your specific observations in between the break. Okay, if you'll look at page 5 in your guides. This is the rectangle represents a timeline. So think about the base of the rectangle as a season of time, 1 to 3 years, maybe 3 to 5 years. Kind of depends on how you want to look at it. And the vertical aspect of the rectangle represents the intensity of what is called an anxiety-provoking event. So someone passing away, for example, that's dearly, dearly beloved could cause quite a bit of anxiety. It could be very, very anxious. Someone having a fender bender in the parking lot could cause anxiety, but you go get the fenders repaired and life goes on and it's not that big of a deal, but it was a close call. Maybe a small child ran out in front of the car, and boy, if it had been just a split second, it could have been disaster. Anxiety-provoking events occur at different levels in the organization. And so when we experience anxiety, it can be positive or it can be negative. And it doesn't really matter. Someone getting married and the person that they married lived in another state, and so they're going to go move to that person's community and live in their home, but that person's been part of your church for 20 years. So it's a positive thing that happened, right? But it still causes anxiety. And so anxiety-provoking events aren't always negative events. And so one of the things that happens, and the sister who asked the question stepped out, so we'll want to make sure that we follow up with her on this. But one of the things that happens is that we have an event that causes us a tremendous amount of anxiety. And in the life of a church, and it's really true of all organizations, but in the life of a church, every 5 to 10 years, we have this 1 to 3 year period that it's just, the adage is, when it rains, it pours. And it's just like, Lord, how much more are we going to have to endure here? We are worn out. And so you have this event that occurs, and before you can really process and deal with that event in a healthy way, the next anxiety-provoking event occurs. And before you can deal with that, the next anxiety-provoking event occurs. And so you have to seal off the pain from the previous events to channel your energies on what's happening now, this new thing that's happening. And so one of the things that I have done with churches in the past is to have a lament service. And we have a Sunday morning where as a church, we just cry out to God for the whole service. And we literally cry. We just take time to mourn and to weep. And I've heard this said, and it's kind of a gross analogy, but it's actually kind of true, that tears are the urine of the soul. Told you it's kind of gross. But I think in some ways it's actually kind of beautiful, you know, that just being able to emote and to let it go, to have some focus groups that are what I would call balanced focus groups, where we invite 6, 7, 8 people in at a time, and maybe they're visiting with a shepherd and his wife, or they're visiting with a couple of shepherds, or however it's chosen to be structured. But it's kind of starting out with, you know, where are some of our pinches? We talk about pinch language, and where have you been pinched? And we always want to end that on a positive, you know, how can we take our pinches and see God bring something beautiful out of that? But that also creates some opportunity just to process, just to be heard, right? So those are a couple of ideas. They're not the only ones. But I found lament services to be very powerful. Have y'all ever done anything like that here, Dan? Have y'all ever had a lament service? Yeah, they can be pretty powerful. And the great thing is you can do a Google search on lament service. And, you know, there's a reason Lamentations is in the Bible, right? There's a reason it's in there. And so we can sometimes find some great joy in that. So I don't want us to process this as a group this morning. This is really an exercise more for you as individuals. As you think back over the past 1 to 3 years, what are some anxiety-provoking events that really caused you a tremendous amount of pain? Okay? And if you'll write it down, so, you know, this event occurred, and then the next event occurred, and then the next event occurred, you're almost going to be able to establish kind of a connect the dots timeline of anxiety-provoking events. And here's what happens in a church. And if any of you have studied systems theory, it's one of the most fascinating dynamics out there. But usually when we are under a lot of stress, not always, but we have a propensity to go to the more basic nature of our humanity. And we sometimes will say things that are really stupid when we're hurting a whole lot. We say things like, everybody up at that church hates me. Or that whole church is just full of a bunch of hypocrites. Right? We make these broad, sweeping, and we're hurting, and so we have a tendency sometimes when we're hurting to just say dumb things, to lash out, to make broad, sweeping generalizations. And so, but seeing our pain graphed out for us kind of helps me understand, wow, I've been through a lot in the last few years. No wonder I feel so discombobulated. No wonder, I want to just punch people in the nose. No wonder I just want to go into a corner, and because I just have had so much on me, or we've had so much on us. Bringing it to conscious awareness is one of the things that can help us understand, Lord, even as I've lived in this pain, I also see where you're at work. And it gives us some opportunity to praise him and to be grateful to the Lord. So any thoughts on anxiety-provoking events? You've had a few, right? I understand you've had a couple in the last few years. And so it kind of goes back to the pinch language. If we don't deal with our anxiety-provoking events, our anxiety-provoking events will deal with us. So there's a very healthy way to process through these things. By the way, the acronym for anxiety-provoking events is APE, and that's exactly what they feel like a big old gorilla. It's just hammering on us, right? And so I think it's important to bring those things to conscious awareness and again, kind of see where God is at work. Okay, it is almost 10 o'clock. So here's what I recommend. I recommend we take a quick break. How much time do you need? 10 minutes? 10 minutes. We'll do 10 minutes. That'll give you a chance to get some coffee, some donuts, hit the restroom, decompress a little bit, stretch your legs, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes and resume on page 6. All right, everybody, it's about 10 after 10, so we'll snag those folks across the hall. That would be great. All right. Ring the bell. That's great. All right. Nate, if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please, would be great. Do I? The clicker. Great, thanks. You'd actually go ahead and go to the next one if you want. Perfect. So just quickly, I want to give you all a little bit of information on kind of what we're going to do next. I want to just give you a score on your assessment that you did. We're not going to dig into the depths of the assessment, the survey rather, but want to let you guys know that as a church, you're in a good, healthy place, and so I'm very thankful for that. Just quickly, when we did the survey, what we didn't want to do is, and I know the terms are somewhat broad, and it's kind of difficult maybe to infer some of the intentions of some of the questions, but this was just generally trying to determine where you are. This would be like going into the doctor's office and getting just a general physical, and then if there's some things that present as some symptoms that may indicate something else is going on, then we want to take a deeper look at that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We talked a little bit about anxiety-provoking events in our last session. And again, bringing that to conscious awareness is one of the healthiest things that you can do as a body. When you sweep stuff under the rug, and you sweep it under the rug, and you sweep it under the rug, what do you ultimately get? A gigantic bump in the rug, okay? And that can cause people to trip. And so it's okay to be open and honest about our pain points and about our joy points as well. We don't want to sit on those either. So if you've got opportunity to share in the gathered assembly or in small groups or whatever it might be, the victories that you're experiencing in Christ, then those also need to be shared. If you look at page 6 of your handouts, go ahead and go to the next slide if we will. One of the questions that I want to just spend a little bit of time on this morning, actually a couple of questions, and this is not an opportunity to throw someone under the bus or an opportunity to, to bash a ministry or a ministry leader. Matter of fact, when we get to question number 2, maybe the ministry leader would want to lead the charge on kind of talking about this a bit. But as you think about your ministries here at the church, and let's just kind of try to identify the top 2 or 3, which ministries are really, really thriving? What's going exceptionally well? Yes, sir. Men's Bible study is doing wonderful. All right. You wouldn't happen to know who leads that, would you? Or adult teaching? Okay, good. Yeah, you have a new initiative, right, that you guys have just rolled out. So
Related to that is we're calling it Pittman Road University.
yeah,
It's generated lots of interest.
that's great.
Adult, yeah.
Very good. Very good. Anything else that's going really well?
I think the women's
Great. Women's ministry and prayer groups that are part of outflow of that. So fantastic. Very good. Very good. All right. Okay, so let's flip the equation a little bit. Do you have any ministries that are just treading water? They're just kind of barely hanging on. Harder question, but yes, sir.
From my experience, I don't know about the other different grades or whatever, but the children's ministries, that are between second
Okay.
grade, it's just like
Okay. Challenging. All right. With that particular demographic. All right. Of some of our younger ones. All right. What else? This is hard, right? Because it's like, oh, the person who leads that ministry is sitting in this room, so I don't want to say that it's treading water, but okay. Yeah. Wasn't sustainable. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else? Wednesday nights in general? Yeah. Wednesday nights in a lot of churches are going the way of the gospel meeting. You know, used to years and years ago, we would do these gospel meetings that would last a week. And generally a lot of folks would come, maybe more of a southern thing, I'm not really sure, but almost no one does that now. Almost no one. Vacation Bible School, you know, and many churches still do them, but a lot of churches don't. Wednesday nights is kind of hard to figure out. What do we do with Wednesday nights? So the reason that we ask questions like this is because it's just really important, and the interim season gives you an opportunity to do this, to take inventory. What is working well and what is not? And it's okay to ask those questions. And one of the things that I would ask, and because you are people of influence, otherwise you would not be in this meeting today, is that when you think about a ministry that just isn't working, it's okay that it's come to the end of its life cycle. It's not a bad thing. It's not an indictment on you that you've done a bad job or that the other person isn't doing what they should be doing. Ministries inside of churches cycle just like the life of the church itself cycles. It's very natural. It's very normal. So when you can get to a place where you're honest enough to ask, what this ministry seems to just be treading water, then perhaps the question to ask is, do we need to renegotiate expectations? Or do we need planned termination, not of the person, but of the ministry, okay? And then reinvigorate, pour the energies into this thing that's dying into something that is fresh and new and is life-giving. I noticed one of the things that we commented on last night, I had a chance to meet with some of the shepherds and some of the shepherds' wives last night, and one of the things that was commented on there was that many times you have a core group of people who often end up being the ones who are kind of driving multiple ministries. And that's very common. It's called the Pareto principle. 20% of the people do 80% of the work, right? And so how do you as a body let some of this ministry go and try to bring other people alongside to either create a mentoring dynamic or a coaching dynamic or whatever that looks like? And I would never want to use the term, this is my ministry. This is my territory. Don't jump in my silo. I would always want to try to be recruiting people to come and walk alongside me and see what we can give away. So the ideal here is just to be honest. Just to be honest. Yes, Dan?
One of my instructors said in undergrad school is one of the problems, he said it this way, with people in the churches of Christ, but it's probably true of all organizations. We take a really, really, really good idea, and then we run it into the ground.
Yes. Yes.
We take something that really works well for a year or 2 years, and we think since it works so well, we better keep doing it. But
Right.
things change, and because a program worked for a while doesn't mean it's Bible. You got to keep doing it that way.
Yes.
So there is that tension when you let a program go.
Yeah.
When you terminate it.
Yeah.
And, whoever invested lots in it is prone to get their feelings hurt.
Yes, that can happen so easily. But if we can reframe those types of dynamics that, let's rejoice in the good that this particular ministry or program did, and let's rejoice in the lives that it changed. And we're always going to be trying to do new things and innovative things. But one of my favorite leadership gurus is Peter Drucker, and he made the observation, when the horse is dead, dismount. That's pretty good counsel, right? And we don't keep, or the other adage, I guess, is, you don't beat a dead horse or whatever. And so, so there's some wisdom there as well. So it's just this honesty. Where is God leading us? What is healthy? What is not? And we're living into that based on the wisdom of our shepherds, the wisdom of our staff, the input of the church, and it can ultimately be just a really, really beautiful thing. But we have to be willing to be honest and open. And sometimes those aren't easy conversations to have, but they're conversations that you have to have if you want to be healthy as a church, right? So a couple things I want to bring to your attention. If we can go to this next slide, there's a resource that I really want to encourage you guys to check out. I talked to the elders about this last night, citydata.com or citydata.com, depends on which part of the country you're from. It's a phenomenal website. And one of the things that you can see on citydata.com is basically all of the demographic information related to your community. So you go on there, you plug in any zip code, and it will give you about every statistic imaginable. And this is based on U.S. Census Bureau data. So it's fairly, the validity, I think, is exceptionally high. Everything from median incomes to houses that have been constructed here, divorce rate, marriage rate, ethnicity breakdown. I mean, it's quite fascinating, all the data that is here. And so as you think about ministry initiatives that you are living into, you can look at, median income. You can look at divorce rates. You can look at where financial stressors might be. And then that might give you some opportunity to identify some ministries that you could use to reach out into the community, some touch points, some starting points. So maybe you look at the data and you go, wow, we haven't done a class on money management in a long time, but it looks like a lot of folks are really hurting financially. So based on the numbers in our population, because it even talks about like how many people per zip code receive some type of federal subsidy assistance. Okay, so you can actually look at the percentages of people in your neighborhoods who are really hurting financially. So those are just some of the examples that you can see. Obviously, it doesn't give you their name and address, but it does provide some data on the numbers of people that are struggling with various things. It shows education, so the number of people who have a bachelor degree, the number of people who have no college degree, the number of people who have advanced degrees. It's quite fascinating, quite fascinating. Yes, sir?
I love that idea. One of the reasons that's difficult for our congregation is we are very much a three-way church. And so we
Correct.
probably have 40 or 50
Yeah,
different zip codes.
exactly. Yeah,
It's not quite as easy.
yeah.
Not making it illegitimate.
No. I understand. Yeah. It is problematic, and one of the cool things that this has is that there's an interactive map that's on there that shows the contiguous locations, so you literally can just kind of bounce zip code to zip code. And if you got somebody who just loves numbers, they just wake up in the morning being so excited about numbers, and you want to ask them to compile a list of all of these, then more power to you, okay? I would probably go ahead and be with Jesus if that were the case. I can't do it. But anyway, a very valid observation, Dan. Thank you for mentioning that. And so as you think about maybe your life groups, if they're meeting in various neighborhoods, then maybe the life group leader could take some of this information and look at some of the unique challenges that his or her particular zip code may be experiencing. So I want to encourage you just to take advantage of that resource. It's free. And it's got some great stuff. Go ahead and go to the next slide, if you will. Nate, we had 114 people that took your survey. Isn't that awesome? 114 people. That's really, really good. And I'm not going to share the data from the survey with you today. I just want to show you a couple of pieces of information that I hope will encourage you. If you go and go to the next slide, it's a little bit hard to read because the red kind of washes out there. But if a church scores 20 to 34 cumulative on the survey, that means that they're probably in a lot of trouble. It's a church that's really, really at risk. Average level of wellness with some areas of improvement is 35 to 44. 45 to 53 is really an above average level of wellness. And then if you go all the way to the top, 54 to 60, that's a church that's pretty much walking on water. Okay, so very, very few churches are in that upper level realm. So you all actually scored on your survey assessment, if you go to the next slide, 43.74. So as you look at the averages, you're right there at that above average level to average level of wellness as a church. And again, this is not in terms of absolutes, okay? It's just in terms of principle. But I want to let you know, when I read through your survey results, I was very encouraged, very, very encouraged. And if I was discouraged, I would tell you. I would just tell you. You're actually one of the healthiest churches that I've worked with in a long time. And so that's really, really good. Now, if you do the more comprehensive survey, you'll be able to drill down and get some additional data. One of the things that was most encouraging to me is the church's trust level of the leaders. That was one of the things, because if the church trusts the leadership, and the leadership is proactively leading versus reactively leading, this is a church that can do some really, really incredible stuff. So the fact that your elders and your staff are trusted is a beautiful thing. God's given you an opportunity to leverage some really, really wonderful things going into the future. The information from the survey will be shared at some point. I don't know how or what that medium will look like, but I'm sure the elders will be processing that and thinking about some ways to push that information out. You got some really, really smart people here. I don't think you're going to have too much trouble figuring out a good way to communicate that to the body. But I want you to be encouraged that overall you're very, very healthy as a body. There's a handful of things to look at triaging as you prepare for the interim season, and just kind of keep doing what you're doing, just do it a little bit better. And I think you'll see some real traction from that effort. Okay, so I want to go ahead and look at this next piece on the life cycle of churches, and then we're going to get into the nuts and the bolts of the search process itself. So let's go ahead and go to the slide, Nate, if you will, please, that has the understanding your church's life cycle on it. So if you'll flip over to page 7, you're going to see on paper the same thing that you see up here on screen. This was developed many years ago by Robert Dale, and he was a gentleman who lived in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's fascinating insights. I just think it's one of the best organizational life cycle representations that I've seen in any of the literature that I've reviewed, and even based on my own lived experience, it's just really phenomenal insights. But one of the things that you will notice is that every church goes through a season of planting, and so a church is birthed at some point. So when was this church established? 1959. So if we go all the way back to 1959 and the birth of this church, you will notice that what happens, and this is very natural, is the church is birthed, and then it goes through a process of growth. And each one of these stages brings phenomenal blessings, but each one of these stages also brings phenomenal challenges. And so one of the things that's happening when a church is birthed, there's a lot of dreaming going on, tremendous amount of prayer, tremendous amount of energies dedicated to finding location, building, and what's it going to look like? What are the expectations that we're agreeing to? So you think about gathering information, going back to our role renegotiation model. It's a very exciting time. You know, when you dated, was it like, yeah, she's okay? I certainly hope not. You know, you were falling in love. It was exciting. It was wonderful. You know, you just couldn't wait to see each other, and your heart just skipped a beat whenever you had a chance to hang out together. So some of that same kind of thing goes on when a church is being birthed. It's a very exciting time. The church then goes into growth, and that growth is usually based on very clear expectations. This is how we operate as a church. These are the things that we believe. This is what we want to. This is how we want to engage people for the sake of the gospel. And then we go to a time as that planning transitions from birth to growth to maturity, that we see ourselves looking at solidifying the leadership and how it interacts with the church, and the expectations, and who's going to be our preacher, and who's going to be our youth minister, and who's going to fill these other roles perhaps that we've got, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the church is kind of growing up. And then this is inevitable. If you build it, you have to take care of it. And so we ultimately get to this place where the arch, where we go over the arch, and we move into maintenance. So we weren't expending as many maintenance energies in the beginning because we were in the building process. But when building became past tense, now we got to take care of it. Okay? So if you go back to the movie Field of Dreams, many, many, many years ago with Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come. Okay? You know that many businesses went broke, by the way, after that movie? Because they believe that? Just because you build it doesn't mean that people will come, all right? That sounded really good in the movie. But, you know, the maintenance of when you build something is not as much fun as the actual building, you know. And so if we're not careful when we move into maintenance mode, we don't have to, but we can begin to go into decline. Because the energies that have formerly been going outward have now turned inward. Rick Warren wrote about this many, many, many years ago when he talked about the purpose-driven life and subsequently the purpose-driven church. That many churches kind of build and then they kind of become a family, and then it becomes difficult for outsiders to come into the family, right? And so if we don't understand that it's a place and a time to revision once we get into maintenance, then the church will begin to decline. And it gets to the place where there is ultimately this tipping point where the body is in such disarray, or there's been no sustainability planning or no revisioning or whatever it might be, that ultimately the church experiences death. This happened recently in my dad's church, a church that had been around for many, many years, many, many decades. And they got to the place where literally all the children who grew up in the community left. And there was no one else in the community to actually even have conversations with about Jesus, because it was in a very rural area. And so a lot of people passed away, a lot of people moved away. And so the church closed its doors last year. And it's very sad. But in all the letters that are in the New Testament to all the churches in the New Testament, how many of those churches still have doors open? Right? Now, there are some churches in those areas, don't get me wrong, but every church has a cycle, a birth cycle, a life cycle, and a death cycle. And God uses churches as He needs to use them for His purposes in its time. And so when we have a kingdom mindset, we don't get totally wrapped around the axle of if a local church, is successful, however we define success, so much as we're concerned about kingdom. Because no matter what happens in a culture, the church will always endure, right? The church will endure. If a church building doesn't, or a local church doesn't, still the church will endure. And so as you think about this, a question that I would have for you guys is, which quadrant best represents where you think you are as a church? So do you think you're rebirthing, or are you maturing, or are you in maintenance mode, or are you declining? Kind of where do you think you are? You can actually answer that question, by the way. That was not a hypothetical or a rhetorical question. I'm sorry? Maintenance?
I fear decline, simply because
Okay.
I look at the children in the church. And when my kids were growing up, we didn't have enough seats for them.
Yeah.
We were busting out
Right.
every classroom.
Right.
And now we have to bring all our ages together
Okay.
to have enough kids to have a class.
Okay. All right. So that would be a marker that would possibly communicate to us, okay, we're thinking about the future. What kind of church do we want to be? Do we want to be a church ultimately that really, really impacts families with young children? So possibly that impacts how we structure, who we bring in, maybe. Okay?
I also agree with Rob. I think what I hear a lot of too is on the bulletin, they publish the amount of the contributions.
Okay?
And that's a constant thing that I hear. Look, our contributions are going down
Okay?
each week. So I know this year they decreased
Mm-hmm.
but we're still not making that.
Okay, decreased budget that we're not meeting.
Sharing. So
Okay,
I hear him saying that a lot to people.
right,
We can't pay your worship. We can't make it to our budget.
right.
I fear, just like Robin, that we're in that decline, and I think that's one of the reasons that you see those numbers each week, and, oh gosh, what are we gonna do?
Right,
We can't pay our bills. What
right.
does this do? So I think it's caused a little bit of,
Yeah, cause some anxiety. Okay, all right, yes.
mostly like almost subtitles, and I feel like we're just like questioning, like
Okay,
quite at where this decline is happening, but asking these questions of like, are we headed this direction?
yeah,
Or where are we going?
yeah,
Kind of like seeing, okay, where on earth are we going to be going
right.
now that we have this transition? Are we going to kind of continue on this down, or are we going to back ourselves up?
Yeah, and I think that's the part that I'm most excited about. Because what happens is unhealthy churches totally ignore this. And they just die. They literally will just die. And we may say, it may even be posted on the church's website, we want to reach the world for Jesus. But what they really believe in their heart of hearts is we're going to grow old and die together. Okay? And that's what they believe truly in their heart of hearts. So you as a congregation, you've got leaders who are savvy enough to recognize some red flags. And so it is a time, you actually experienced this already over the last year or so, a time to revision and a time to re-mission. And you're just kind of in the early phases of living into that. Yes, sir.
From your experience, is it possible to have a church that's between 3 and 4, or maybe into the 4, to regroup and go
Absolutely.
back around the other?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind that God does that quite often, actually. And I've seen it happen. I have seen churches that were... Yeah. Well, I mean, I've seen churches that are literally 6, 8, 9 months away from being in very, very serious trouble. And but when they go through a revisioning process and the church as a whole starts to row in the same direction, that becomes a beautiful thing for people to walk into and experience, because you can experience the true joy of the Lord in that place.
And I think it's also important to acknowledge what the true facts are, like what they're saying.
Yes.
It's like, read the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
Say what it is.
Yeah.
Call it what it is and deal with it.
Yes. Yeah. I agree. And just be open and just be honest. Sure. And again, it's not, we don't finger point. That's not what this is about. Yeah, but it also, we're not in denial. Yeah. And a couple comments here.
The thing that scares me about this chart is, and I do feel, when we got here, when we moved to this building, I felt we were in maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after being here several years, I feel we slipped into decline. How do you get from the decline back over to maybe the growth or rebirth? Because there's not from this chart, the way I read it, it goes from decline to death, not rebirth.
Yeah. Okay, so this is not the end of the story, so hang on. I'll come back to that, because there is a way to go back. There is a way to go back to the beginning. Yeah, and you're already doing it. You're already doing it as a church, and it is you've decided, you've redefined your mission. And I want to use this as an opportunity to really thank you, truly. Because, I even see ministers sometimes that will say, well, if I'm going, I'm taking a bunch of people with me. All right? And that's so unhealthy, but you're so blessed to have someone as selfless to kind of be saying, hey guys, I want us to be healthy and move forward well. And so what a blessing that is. So let me move forward a little bit. And if you'll look at this next slide, go ahead and go to the next one. A question is, and I've got this drawn out on page 7 for you, are you in a place of renewal, or are you in a place of stagnation? And this chart helps us understand that we can get to a place if we get into just maintenance. And you'll notice the word up there, nostalgia. Oh, don't you remember how it was back when? Wasn't it great when we all? Yeah, the good old days. And sometimes we can get stuck back in those times. But God is using His church in very unique circumstances and situations and times for His purposes at that particular moment in time. So, did you have an observation or a question?
So, I mean, I guess kind of just, going around what we discussed, I feel like we're in between this maintenance and decline phase, and, what Mallory was saying with, like,
Okay.
last year, and the numbers are declining. So
Yeah.
does it mean more than just putting these words together? You know what I mean?
For
So
sure.
I guess that's where
Yeah.
that's where I'm at.
When we talked about that a little bit last night, that it's got to be more than just words on a page, right? That we've got to talk about what does this look like lived out behaviorally in the body of Christ. Yeah.
You know, we talked the rectangle, and we talked about that last
Yeah.
time. You know, we've had 3 years, probably 5 years
Yeah.
of pretty heavy duty stuff.
Yes.
On the plus and minus side, but a lot mostly on the minus side. And I think leadership wise, it's been coping with those. And I feel that's why, even though we went through this revisioning, why we're probably further down towards maybe decline.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's not an uncommon
No,
dynamic.
not at all.
So, I mean, how do, as leadership, how do we help ourselves to not get bogged down by that and start backing ourselves
Yeah.
up a little bit?
Great.
Because we don't know that the hits aren't going to be,
Sure.
you know, and I think
Sure.
from a kingdom standpoint, the more we try to back up, those hits are going to come. So leadership-wise, I mean, is that something your organization will help them, us, maybe regroup and learn how to rise above our current
Yeah.
troubles?
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the beautiful things about partnering together, because, you know, if you have an outsider that comes in, the outsider can come with a fresh lens and more of an objective kind of mindset. You know, I used to own a truck that had an issue on the radio, but I knew how to jiggle the knob to get it to work, right? Because it was my truck. So if somebody else came in and drove my truck, they'd say, "Dude, your radio's broken." I'm like, "Yeah, I know. But I know how to operate it." So you guys have things in here that are probably broken, but you know how to tweak them, you know, and push them and kind of make it work. But someone with fresh eyes can come in and say, "Oh, that really needs to be more of a permanent fix, not just a Band-Aid or whatever." But yeah, that's something that we would want to do in working with the leadership to help understand. Okay, this is your desired outcome. These are your desired outcomes. This is the future you want to live into. How are you going to do that? What are the specific steps that you're going to have to do that? But I also want to come back and address, and I think when we get to the next slide here, we'll do that. Did you have an observation?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention quickly, like I'm a newer member here,
Uh-huh.
and so I don't have like the nostalgia looking back and how things were. Maybe I just, you know, I feel the concern about the decline, but I like to be a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah.
I look at the focus of the growth, I see like trunk or treat, the wellness fair,
Yeah.
what they do with the family promise, the outreach there.
Sure.
And you know, this was the first year with the Pittman parade. So I look at that kind of thing, the outreach with the community.
Yeah.
I think that's really helped be positive.
Yeah.
So I don't want to like focus on the decline too much.
Right. Right. Yeah. We don't want to be Debbie Downers, right? So let me speak to this, and let me speak to both of those things. Yes, please.
So I just a couple things. One is the interesting thing about something like this is in the nostalgia phase when everybody wants to remember how good things were, and you're actually starting to remember.
Yes.
And that's something to keep in mind when we kind of go back sometimes mentally.
Yeah.
Back to those good old days. The reality is that's when you really started.
Yes.
I think, you know, a couple other things to keep in mind is this division process, which is new. As it continues to develop, it is an opportunity to you know, turn the curve around or
Correct.
around to the other side. I think that's important. I think two other things that we don't see when we look at data, because data is very, very tough, but just from two things I would say to be aware of that are actually very positive, if you will, is when you look at contributions, you see the numbers coming down. You look over the last 10 years, and you see the Sunday mornings coming down. But when you look at, if you will, the amount of contributions per person has actually gone up. So the amount of people that are invested are actually invested.
Yeah.
You know, is believing more in that. And if you look at recently with the reboot of the Bible classes, the old Bible classes specifically, you're seeing that ratio come closer to a Sunday morning to the Bible class ratio, which is also very positive. People are reinvesting in what Tony wanted.
Yeah.
And last thing I would say is, when you do a vision and you start looking at things differently, there is bluntly, there's pruning that goes on.
Yeah.
And each of us are being pruned, and sometimes when you prune, you choose silence.
Yeah. Right.
Or be dogmatic.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Yeah, that was beautiful insights. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah.
And this whole discussion about nostalgia drives me crazy about how it was so much better at the other building
Uh-huh.
and things were better when this happened and all that. I very much appreciate what Mark said and also what John is summarizing. The way I see it, the way I think most people can hear me.
There's people streaming that can't hear, that's why
Oh.
The people that are watching from afar.
Okay, okay.
Comments and they keep talking.
Is it on?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it is on. Okay, it is on. It is on. Got it.
All right, so we've only been here a couple of years, and for me, I look at it a little differently, the whole situation. The problem of going into the slide and the decline is, I think, churches that simply refuse to acknowledge issues that exist. And I look at our situation here at Pittman, I feel very invested in the situation
Sure.
here. So many things have happened in the last 2 years. Key families have moved away. There's been a change in the elders, for example. Several elders that were here for a huge, long period of time are gone. Others have stepped in. 2 of our ministers are gone. One died. The other one went on a church planting. One is retiring or entering retirement age. And in spite of all of those things, so many wonderful things continue to happen in
Yes.
the body. And there's no fear about trying new things. And when they don't work, looking for another solution. The whole Wednesday situation, for a year trying something different, didn't work.
Yeah.
The leader said, okay, it didn't work, we're going to try something different. So I think this awareness, this healthy involvement on the part of the members of the body, trust in the leadership, a lot of those things are elements that we haven't seen at other churches. So I feel extremely optimistic and very positive by this whole experience.
Yeah. That would be a good thing to be said on a Sunday morning, don't you think? I'd just go ahead and preach that sermon again if I were you. I'd just turn right around and, because I'm serious, that's good. It's really good stuff. I am so incredibly optimistic about what the Lord has, not only has done, but what the Lord, will do. And even in the midst of anxiety that you have experienced as a church, just think about the seeds that have been planted. The seeds of hope and renewal and new direction. And when you go through a visioning process, it takes anywhere from 1 to 5 years before the seeds of a visioning process really, really take root. Now, there's those examples of when, a church gets on fire and things can really explode overnight, but those are really, really few and far between. It's the planning, and then we allow God to give the increase, and God's going to do that in God's time, not on our timeline. And so I appreciate what you shared. Did you have an observation?
I was going to just add that, the Bible even says, don't talk about the good old times, because every time has had its mix of good
Right.
and bad. One thing I wanted to ask, and this is just purely curiosity, hypothetical. I don't think this applies to the church whatsoever, so please nobody have a heart attack when I mention this. But have you ever had any experiences with churches that kind of realized that, we're going on a decline and there's really not a possibility of a rebirth, so we're going to go into death, and so how do churches deal with that when that's a possibility, and how do they know that we know now that there's no possibility, it's a death, and then how did they handle with that?
Yeah, I have no experience with that personally. I do know some other individuals who have, and they just really go into a very proactive phase of figuring out how to liquidate assets and those kinds of things. But I've not worked with a church yet where that's been the case. So
Well,
I'd have to defer to some other experts on that. Let me have you guys take a look at these next. I'm sorry.
If you experience death, then you will not be good for us. We want someone that, yeah.
Exactly. I was preaching. I was leading some communion thoughts in Ukraine not too long ago, and I love your honesty and because I was talking about the Lord loves a cheerful giver, and I said and guys, quite honestly, God loves an uncheerful giver too. But the cheerful giver experiences the fuller joy of the Lord. And the preacher for the Russian church, or the Ukrainian church said, "Don't say that. People won't give." Right in the middle of the assembly. But it was awesome. It was really awesome. So look at this next slide, if you will. This kind of shows you the. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. This kind of shows you the just an example of the arch again. But notice the next slide. So the ideal is, in a church's life cycle, as it goes through birth, growth, and we get to that place where we're going to kind of then go in from maturity over to the tipping point of maintenance, when the church realizes it is getting to maintenance, what is the thing to do? We go back to revisioning. And that process repeats itself again and again and again. Now, there is no timeline associated with this, so some churches may do this once a year. Some churches may do this once every 5 years, every 10 years. Generally speaking, your vision, the future that God is calling you to live into, your vision is going to be about a 10-year proposition. Your mission will be evaluated probably about every 3 to 5 years. Okay? So the how-to part, the how to get from where we are to where God is leading us to be. So at the A&M Church where I work, we just went through the visioning process just right before my arrival. And the church's vision is following Jesus to upside down living. So that's our desired future state. We want to be a church that thinks outside the box. We want to be a church that doesn't measure success by worldly metrics. We want to measure success by spiritual outcomes and lives that we see being changed. We want to be creative on purpose, okay? So when people think about us, we want them to say, yeah, I've never been to a church like this. So that's upside down. That's the desired outcome. So our mission, how we want to accomplish that, is to create spaces where people can belong with us and become like Jesus. So there's really 3 phases there. The first is we're intentionally creating relationship spaces. So whether that's small groups or Bible classes or the workplace or neighborhood or whatever that looks like, we want people that are within our circles of influence to have a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And we have other movements that are associated with that. We talk about hospitality, we talk about service, we talk about mission. And so there are different elements of that. But the idea is once we identify the outcome that we desire, we then create the avenues that help us live into that desired outcome. And that's revisioning, because we don't want to go into decline. If you don't revision, then you're setting yourself up for certain death, right? And churches of Christ, we also have very unique challenges, and this is not, I'm not saying this to start a theological debate, but just think about how we've operated historically. You know, we've been very tight with equipping sisters for various aspects of service. So depending on the giftedness that one of our sisters in the Lord might have, we've had our circle of people that we can go out and engage, and we've kind of shrunk that circle a little bit. And so we've had things like our conversations about music, for example, and giftedness related to music. And so we've kind of shrunk the circle a little bit of people who can't find places to serve or exercise some of their giftedness. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to start a debate. I'm just saying there have been certain things that we have said no to as a fellowship. And by saying no to those things, the greater community pool of people who would want to engage with the community of faith that is saying no to some things, we have to be honest, we have to be realistic about how that's not going to positively impact some people, depending on their giftedness and their skill sets and those kinds of things. And I'm not talking rightness and wrongness. I'm just saying that's just the nature of outreach, right? So we have to be open about that and honest about that as well. So the key is to revision. And when we go into relationships with churches, this is the part that we focus on the most with the leadership at the beginning of the process. Clearly helping a church identify what its desired outcomes are, and then working through strategies to live into those desired outcomes. So there's a couple of books I would recommend to your leadership team. One is Autopsy of a Deceased Church. Autopsy of a Deceased Church, and this is by Tom, T-H-O-M, Rainer, Tom Rainer. Tom is, I can't remember his title with Lifeway Resources. He may be the executive director, I can't recall. But anyway, he's kind of a research guru. He's got a great blog, Tom Rainer. He's got a great church blog if you want to go check that out. Another book that I like to recommend, and it's not for everybody, but it is a book called Deep and Wide by Andy Stanley. Deep and Wide. And you won't agree with everything that he says, but their church's vision statement is creating a church that unchurched people love. Andy Stanley, S-T-A-N-L-E-Y, yeah, Andy Stanley. He's at the North Point Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Charles Stanley's son, yeah. And he's written a lot of books, but I love Deep and Wide because in that book he talks about specifically how they engage unbelievers. And so they may have an unbeliever who shows up on a Sunday and may be running the soundboard the next Sunday. They find ways to give people jobs so that they can rub shoulders with people who are believers. You know? Do you have to believe that Jesus is Lord before you can run a soundboard? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, praise the Lord. So you're off to... Yeah. You're already off to a great start. So that's fantastic. The precedent's already established. So those are just a couple of really good resources, and there's many, many more out there. But I like to start with those because I just think they provide some great foundation to help us understand how we as a body can start trying to engage, and also what practices do we need to stay away from. So, you know, when people walk in our doors, do they feel welcomed? Do they feel a sense of excitement that they're there? And, you know, you've got such a beautiful facility. And I know I was welcomed so warmly last Sunday. And I'm hoping that your other guests who walk in the doors, because when I first walked in the doors, nobody had any idea who I was. So I was really greeted warmly.
The exact opposite, which I sometimes fear we might do, is do they feel smothered?
Yes, it's kind of a balance, right?
There is that
Yeah.
fine line.
It's kind of a balance, and that's not necessarily easy to discern, right? I've always thought it would be kind of fascinating if somebody visited for the first time and like the entire church went, you know, to their house and sang a song in their front yard or something. So that would be quite overwhelming. So the idea is to revision, and that's part of our strategy as an organization. Now, again, whether you choose to partner with us or not, I think it's incredibly important to constantly evaluate, you know, your mission. And is it helping us live into our vision? But the key question for me is, what does it look like lived out behaviorally in the body? You have to put descriptive language to it because clear expectations equals clear commitment. People can't know what they don't know. I can say to the church, we want to be warm and we want to be welcoming and we want to be loving. Sounds really good, doesn't it? Okay, so what does that look like lived out in the body? What does warmness look like lived out in the body? When people walk through our doors, how are we going to treat them? What's our follow-up strategy? What are we going to invite them to first? If we have an event like Trunk or Treat, what's the next event that we're strategically thinking about engaging those people in? Is it a candlelight service on Christmas Eve? You know, is it Christmas morning worship? What is it? What's the next thing? The next entry point for people to have opportunity to be exposed to Jesus through us. So I do have a mission and vision slide deck that I've spent quite a bit of time developing, and I'm going to share that with your elders and staff, and that may be something that they choose to work through independently, or maybe we can pop back up on a weekend or something and work through it together. But my desire is just for you guys to be as healthy as you possibly can be. If we move into maintenance mode, and if we'll go ahead and go to this next thing, and this I'm not talking here in terms of absolutes, but sometimes churches, when they get into maintenance, you can see a pastor or a minister who's kind of coasting, and that can get into, we can see that in that environment sometimes. The leadership can be really, really tired. But you've got this committed core of individuals who are doing the vast majority of the work. The vision's kind of broad. It's kind of vague. We kind of know what it is, but we kind of don't. Planning and problem solving, it's kind of always reactive. We're not being very proactive. Ministry is kind of scattered. It's kind of all over the place. There really are very, very few levels of accountability, if any. The congregational life can kind of be ingrown. It's all about taking care of us and keeping our people happy. We can go into nostalgia. So these are just some of the things that we see. Outreach is kind of sporadic. The overall strategy is, hey, everybody come. Or as we say in the South, y'all. Vitality rather is kind of narrowed. Expectations and hopes, and boy, I wish somebody would do something to turn this thing around, versus getting up off the bench and jumping in there and helping out. So these are the kind of things that if you see these symptomatically, then, there's opportunity to think through, okay, how can we respond to some of these things that we see thematically in a very healthy and very, very life-giving, way. Okay, so now it's time to talk nuts and bolts. How do we do this thing called interim ministry? And I'm going to give you our framework. As I said earlier, it is a framework, not the framework, but one that we are seeing quite a bit of success in. And it's important, absolutely positively, when you start thinking about setting up your committee, when you start thinking about moving into the framework, it is just incredibly important that once we do buy into this, or whatever your framework is, that you stay committed to it and that the expectations are very clear. So when we think about setting up the committee, some selection criteria. So we're going to do a little bit of bouncing around here. If you'll flip over to page 9, you'll see some information here that I'm going to be covering on the slides. And then we'll come back before we wrap and look back at page 8 and the top of page 9. Generally, a committee needs to be comprised of about 12 to 15 people. If you get beyond that, it becomes unwieldy, and your meetings will be so incredibly long. Jesus turned the world upside down with 12, so we think it's a good number, Demographic representation, so it needs to be a broad cross-section of the church. And the best committees that I've worked with had from at least one high school senior all the way up to someone, probably in their late 70s, early 80s, and you had this true slice of life of the church. Men and women probably needs to be about an equal balance of people. The people who serve on the committee need to be spiritually mature. So, we need folks who have a deep prayer life, people who are in the Word. They don't have to be biblical scholars, but they need to be people who have some maturity in the Lord. Probably some varied time with the church, and so I wouldn't want to stack my committee with people who've been here 30 years. I think it would be wise to have some folks who've been here 3 or 4 years, all the way up to some people who have been here for a really, really long time. Also, people who have leadership potential. So while we're asking them to serve on the search team, we're kind of doing so with a long-term view of knowing that this is going to put some really great leadership tools in their leadership toolboxes. And so how can God use them post-search to lead some other initiatives? So there's kind of a mentoring dynamic that goes on here that can be replicated in future projects and endeavors. And then we are looking for very particular skill sets. And I'll show you the roles and the skills that are required when we're putting this team together that speak to this last bullet point here on particular skill sets. So the first is, if we go to the next slide, the first is the committee chair. The committee chairperson can be male, female, it doesn't really matter. It's totally up to you. What you just need is someone who is extremely well organized. And you also need someone who is highly trusted by the vast majority of the church. Because this is the person who will be providing some updates to the church. This is the person who will be most closely dialoguing with the elders. I typically do not recommend that the committee chair is a staff person. I have been in a situation where that was the case and it did work well. But usually the staff is pretty busy already. And so putting one more thing on their plate can then cause other ministries to suffer. So that's just a decision that you'll have to make as a church. But your committee chair needs to be competent. He or she needs to have an exhibited track record of leadership. And they need to be highly, highly trustworthy. The other individual the committee chair will be working closely with is the consultant. The way that I work with my committee chairs is that at the beginning, the first 4 or 5 meetings, I kind of kickstart the meetings, I kind of set the agenda, and then after about that 4th or 5th meeting, that is all turned over to the committee chairperson. So I start to decrease as the committee chair increases, because I'm ultimately going to leave. And the committee chair is going to be the one that, as a result of his or her influence, will have a lot of shelf life as far as leadership in the church is concerned. We also have, and we'll just kind of go ahead and push that list up if you want, an elder staff liaison. So there is one elder or one staff person who needs to serve on the committee. They don't necessarily have to serve as an active committee member, but they need to be at the committee meetings so they can keep the elders informed and the staff informed of what's going on. A prayer chair. This is a person who is not just orchestrating what happens as far as prayers are concerned in the context of the committee meetings, but is also taking on responsibility to guide the church prayerfully during the interim season. So creating a prayer schedule, working with individuals who lead prayers to provide information about specific things that need to be prayed about or people who need to be prayed for. And so it's not just about what happens in the context of the committee, it's what happens as far as the overall congregation is concerned as well. A tech chair, so this is someone who is really, really tech savvy and is no stranger to computers or online software or whatever it might be. We use a lot of technology in our searches. We use project management software called Trello, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. And it's worked very, very well for us. And then we also use Zoom video. And so that allows us to do HD video with candidates. And this has been a wonderful blessing to churches because you don't have to fly candidates in for interviews anymore. You can literally interview them online, and it saves thousands of dollars in travel expenses. We also need someone to be a PR chair. This is the person who is going to keep the congregation informed of what's happening in the search process. The only thing we don't do is, of course, give candidate names. Hey, we just talked to so-and-so who is at this church in Nashville, and when Abraham Lincoln died, if I'm not mistaken, it took 7 days before people in Europe knew that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. I can sneeze today and tweet it, and people in Australia can know in 30 seconds, okay? So that's the world that we live in. So we have to be really cautious about confidentiality. The church needs the church search team needs a secretary. And this is someone who will take detailed notes of search meetings because we really, really want there to be a good archived, what I would call an audit trail as we go back and look at decisions that were made and that kind of thing. So someone who is really, really good at taking notes and will make sure not only they're good at taking notes, but make sure those notes are accessible so that people on the committee will be able to access those. We need a congregational assessment lead, and so this is the person who will take responsibility for the comprehensive survey, the one that takes about half an hour to complete, and it's the deep dive survey. So if you've got a statistics guru in the church, maybe someone who has familiarity with a program like SPSS, or some other statistical software, that would be a fantastic resource. A community assessment lead, and this is someone who's going to take lead on going out and doing the interviews that we talked about with the mayor perhaps, or the chief of police perhaps, or others. A kingdom assessment lead, and that's the one who will set up appointments with area churches that are growing. A congregational history lead, this is someone who will take responsibility for drafting a history of the church. And a recommenders lead. Recommenders are individuals who are familiar with this church, and that's our first line of defense when it comes to getting candidate names. So who are people who know this church well? So immediately, Patrick Mead comes to mind. He spent a lot of time with you here. He knows you as a church. He knows the type of preaching you've been exposed to and some of the unique challenges that you've had. He knows this part of the country. So he would readily recognize, once you identified the ideal description of or the description of your ideal candidate, someone whose head and heart is aligned with that. And so I know Randy Harris has spent quite a bit of time here. I've spent some limited time with you, but I already feel like I know you pretty well. So I would be someone that would probably serve as a recommender. Some of your former elders, some of your current elders, possibly some of your former ministers, your current ministers, others who've come in and done work here, people who were members here for a long time and moved to other places, right? So we want to try to create this network of people who know you well, and once the ideal candidate profile is developed, who then can identify people whose head and heart are aligned with that. And then an ideal candidate description lead. And I'll show you more on that here in just a second. So there's a couple of different things that we can look at here. If we've got a committee of 12 to 15 people, as we're putting the committee together, we can put people on the committee who possess these types of gifts, okay? It could be that your tech chair also does your kingdom assessment or serves as the lead on that. But what we really want to try to do is spread the love, okay? So that you can have multiple committee members kind of taking on one particular task that's very important to them. But each of the committee members, as we have names that come in, keep this in mind, will have other roles as well. This is only part of what they're responsible for. But there are other roles that they'll be engaging as they go through the search. So let me stop and ask, do you have any questions about this part? About setting up at least just the initial characteristics that we're looking for?
This is very practical. Would your recommendation be for example, I assume the elders will be involved in this process. Would they make those determinations of who we would think would be in each area, or would the committee, once it's formed, make those decisions?
Yeah, I think the elders are identifying the individuals who, in broad brushstroke terms, have these characteristics, and then my recommendation would be that when the committee gets together, that the committee actually negotiates based on the committee's giftedness. Yeah, that's just my recommendation. Okay? Do you have a question? Okay, same question. Okay, great, very good. All right. And it's so cool to watch this come together. I mean, it is just so neat to see how this forms and comes together, and the synergy that's created. It's a beautiful thing.
So thinking about we want diversity,
Mm-hmm.
we have an 85-year-old who went on the committee, 85 years old, I'm not good at writing, I'm not good at technology, I don't want to talk to churches.
Yeah.
We still need that demographic represented.
If the person is going to be create a lot of I can't, or I won't, I would rather I would almost rather not have that person on the committee, even representing the demographic, because my fear would be that there could be some other negative vibes that come out. I would just get as close as possible. So if I got somebody in their 70s who has the trust, I would get as close as possible. Yeah, but I don't want to speak in terms of absolutes. I mean, Moses told God, "No way," and God said, "Yeah, you're gonna go. You're gonna go. And here's Aaron; he'll help you." Okay, so the committee, no one on the committee serves in a vacuum. So everybody is really cooperating and that sort of thing. But if it's just outright resistance, no way I'm going to do that, then I would just say, okay, thanks. We're going to move on to somebody who's really enthusiastic. I wouldn't say that to the person. Since you're not enthusiastic, we're going to find somebody who is. That's probably not good. But I would want to get folks on who are definitely committed. So we think about calling a search team. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. calling a search team, ignore the word tomorrow. Ignore the word tomorrow in there. That was actually left in from last night's presentation. Setting expectations, we've already talked about that. Conversation and invitation, scheduling some type of a formal dinner occasion, creating covenant, and then creating the charge. And so we're going to go through each of those points here in the next few moments. So if you've got your handouts, let's just go ahead and look there for just a sec. And I want to flip over on page 10. And so we get into choosing and charging here. And so I want to just read this paragraph, because if I ask you to read it later, you probably won't. So no offense, that's just how we're wired. So choosing and charging a search committee is obviously an important and defining step in the search process. An invitation to serve on this committee is not a reward for a long service or an honor bestowed on valued members. This is a working committee that cannot afford any dead weight or nominal participants. The work may be long and hard. It will require discipline, prayer, sweat, and maybe blood, although I've never actually seen literal blood in a committee meeting. People who won't work or can't take direction or start strong but fizzle out should not be asked to serve, no matter who they are or how much they may demand to have input into the search process. That's why we don't, by the way, ask, we're going to form a search committee, who would like to be on it? Okay? We shoulder tap. And that's why many of you are here today, because the elders see in you the capacity that is being described here. The invitation to serve should make this work expectation crystal clear. There's the expectation language again. Formalizing this service is highly recommended. It will be a spiritual high point for those asked to serve, many of whom have never been commissioned or entrusted with an important spiritual work. Asking them to sign a covenant, and you can look in Appendix A here in just a sec, and giving them a formal charge will heighten the sense that they are being called to something spiritually significant. So here's an example of what this might look like. On a Saturday morning, there is a meeting date. We describe the responsibilities. We set the expectations. So when you all think you are ready to begin your search process, then this template would give you an opportunity to say, okay, we're going to have our invitees meet at this place at this time and offer the formal invitation to serve on this team. Are you going to have a makeup session for folks who possibly can't be there? And then there is this commissioning evening, possibly on a Saturday evening. You get together for dinner and you go through the signing of the covenant. You go through the formal call and inviting. There could be prayer, fasting, discernment that you engage in if you're invited to serve, that you give your time to say yes or no. And then another window, the shepherds pray, discuss. And so you can see that a process like this takes a tremendous amount of time. And I would be really wary if I walked up to someone and said, hey, we're thinking about putting this search team together and your name has been recommended. I would be wary of someone who on the spot says, oh, I'm in. I'm in. I would really want to encourage people to pray about it and to think about it. This is going to be a pretty substantive commitment. You're looking, at months, and you're probably looking at meeting on average about once every 7 to 10 days. So it's a pretty substantive commitment that you're making. You'll notice that there are some steps in the process. If we can go to the next slide. There's pre-work, and there is inquiry. There's identification. If you'll flip over to page 11, there is the interview phase. There is the invitation phase. And then there is the post-work phase. And I'm going to break all of these down for you here in greater detail. Notice on page 11, if you'll flip over, there's two common search team formation mistakes that we want to make sure we stay away from. First is packing the committee with people with a lot of business savvy and hiring experience, but don't understand the psychology of ministers or the theological or spiritual nature of calling a new minister to a church. So, you may say, well, we've got 15 people who all have HR experience. They've done a lot of hiring and a lot of firing. That's who we should put in our committee. I would say probably one, maybe two, people who've got some background information. And I'm not diminishing business savvy. I was in the business world for 10 years, and there's a lot of great business principles out there. But we are a spiritual organization first and foremost, right? So just something to keep in mind. Also, packing the committee with people who use spiritual lingo or have firm opinions about ministerial characteristics but couldn't organize themselves out of a wet paper bag. Okay? So it's kind of this fine balancing act that we want to engage in. And, if you have somebody in your church who is a known troublemaker, don't put him on your search team. Okay? If you've got someone who is a known whiner, don't put him on the search team. All right? We want people who are charactered, who are committed, who are going to be in this for the long haul and really, really can help us, listen to God and get us where we need to be. Any questions so far? We're about to talk real nuts and bolts here. Okay? All right, flip over to page 12, if you will. So how long should the interim period last? Probably about 6 to 18 months. That's kind of the general rule. It has been longer. There's a certain amount of time where we have to, we grieve. We've got to bring some closure to transition. And especially if someone's been at a place for a long, long time, then generally the interim may be longer. And one of the things that happens when you have, and this is not always the case, but a lot of times when you have a minister who's been at church for a really, really long time, so 33 years in your case, sometimes the next guy comes and only lasts about 14 to 18 months because the church didn't really have time to kind of mourn the transition. So one of the things that Interim Ministry Partners does on purpose is we absorb some of the church's pain. And so you don't have to have the scapegoat who comes in and, this is not the way our last preacher did this, And I'm sure you will want to do this the same way that Dan did, right? And I know you've got a unique dynamic here in your preaching structures, and so that's actually a blessing, I think, in the way you've looked at it from a preaching perspective. From a leadership perspective, you're still going to have some of that same kind of pain. And transitioning. And so there's a purposefulness to some time to allow the church to actually transition from one preaching minister to the next. It also takes time to do the hard work of thinking through, second paragraph, what kind of person you are looking for. Who are we? Where are we going? Where is God calling us? What kingdom mission are we meant to accomplish? Who are our neighbors? What are the needs of our community? How are we going to serve and reach our city? How can we make a real difference? These questions help you define the skills, competencies, experience, and heart of your next minister. Anyone can hire a minister who can write a nice sermon for Sunday mornings. Finding someone who can excite and lead, pick up the church's vision, and carry it forward, work with the needs and people God has gathered around you takes care, effort, and time. And that's true. And think about even in our own fellowship. If we were hiring a preacher in the 1950s, it would be easy. Because you could have gone to any Church of Christ in the 1950s and basically had the exact same experience, and we all were pretty much interested in the exact same outcomes. That is radically changed. Radically changed. And so your unique church has unique DNA. You have a unique thumbprint, a unique purpose. We got to go find the unique individual whose head and heart are aligned with that. Okay? Very quickly, by the way, I'll give you this just very quickly. I was with Doug Peters this past Monday. Or Tuesday rather, at Oklahoma Christian, and he had one of the greatest illustrations I've ever heard. He talked about the importance of ground rules, how that an organization makes decisions, and he referenced Major League Baseball. And if you go to the Major League Baseball, MLB.com, I think it is, you can actually look up the league-wide ground rules that all teams have agreed to play by. But you can also look up individual ballpark ground rules. And so if you're playing in Fenway versus playing in LA, there may be some unique ground rules about what constitutes, a ground rule double or whatever it might be, or what to do with the flagpole out in center field or whatever it might be. And so I thought, that's such a cool thing, that your church has its own ground rules that another church might not necessarily play by, right? And that's okay. That's okay. When people come to your church, hey, these are our ground rules. This is how we do things here. And you don't have to apologize for that. So anyway, do some more exploring on that on your own. If you're a baseball fan, maybe you can find some more analogies there. So at the bottom of the page, you have this thing that is impossible to read. It is called a timeline for search process. And that is the smallest print, I think, in the world. Even putting it up on the slide doesn't really help us any. But the good thing is I'm going to forward this slide deck to the elders, and so Garth will have a copy of this, a digital copy of this, and you can take this and blow it up as much as you would like and print it off. But I want to walk kind of step by step through the phases, and I did take some of the nuggets from each one of these and outline these in these various phases that we are looking at here on page 12. And so just kind of stick with me there on the timeline for the search process. And as you're going through that, if you have the ability to see some of those smaller words there, maybe a word or a two or a phrase, it really jumps off the page at you. A couple things I want to draw your attention to before we wade into this. And we're going to go about 15 or 20 more minutes, guys, and we'll be done. Notice at the bottom, prayer runs the length, okay? We talked about that last Sunday, that you got to be committed as a body of believers to prayer for the whole process. Each of these, if you'll notice at the bottom, you see in those purple squares, you see the teaching themes. So when we talk about consistent pulpit presence, when we are in phase 1, we talk about a theology of calling. Those are the sermon topics that we ask the preaching minister, or if the consultant is providing the preaching, to cover during those first 3 to 4 weeks or so. We then move into preaching themes on biblical leadership. What does this mean for the elders to proactively lead a church? How do the shepherds partner with the staff for effective ministry? Responding to God's call, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of the ways that the preaching walks hand in hand with what's happening in the search process, in the committee, and in the context of the elders as well. So if you look at each one of these phases, the first is pre-work. If we'll go to the next slide, please. The first is pre-work. And so the key question for us here is, are we a healthy, effective church? And so we've talked about that some this morning. You've been able to do some pre-work on this brief survey that we did. You can do much, much more pre-work to the degree that you feel like you need to. You've done some of this pre-work before we started even having this conversation as you worked into vision and mission. And so some of the key things that we try to accomplish here is it's primarily working with the elders first and foremost, but also with the staff. It is time consuming. You don't just say, yeah, our mission sounds good, let's just stick with that. We talk a whole lot about, okay, how are we going to live it out organizationally? How are we going to transition it from head to heart? How are we going to live it out? It's important for informing the committee's work. The committee can't really start its work until the elders have finished theirs. Now, there's some nuts and bolts kind of stuff that we can take a look at. But really, the heart of the committee's work starts when the elders have said, this is who we are, this is where we're going, and this is how we're going to get there. Okay? And then there's often some time overlap, and that goes back to what I just said, that the committee can begin to do some things, like, for example, the community assessment and the kingdom assessment and those kinds of things, which in some ways may actually be reciprocal. That may inform some of the work that the eldership is doing. Okay? So as I said, I'm going to give Garth a copy of this slide deck, and so if you don't feel like you have to write all of this down, he can distribute that to anyone that would like to have a copy, just as long as you don't start your own interim ministry partners organization, please. So the second phase is the inquiry phase, and this, the primary question here is, who are the skilled, charactered, committed people we should be talking to in this search? Okay? And so we approach resource people. Earlier you heard me use the term recommender. We reach out to recommenders who know this church well. We provide the description of our ideal candidate. We provide the narrative of where we're going as a church and how we're going to get there. We continue to report results from the church assessments during this phase, and we're continuing to compile that data as the picture is getting clearer and clearer. We use our recommenders to develop a list of high-profile candidates. We then, as a committee, pray over these candidates. We discuss these candidates. We start to rank these candidates based on the initial anecdotal evidence that we're gathering, or the resumes that we're receiving, or the feedback that we're getting from our recommenders. We then train committee members on what we call host functions, triad functions, and full committee functions. So if we receive a candidate and the committee looks at this candidate and they say, hey, this is someone worth having a conversation with, we assign a host to that candidate. And the host walks the journey with this candidate from the very beginning to the very end. Whether that end is thanks but no thanks, or hearing from the candidate, oh, I've just prayed about it, I've thought about it, I don't think this is the right time for us or the right fit for us. Or to the end when this candidate actually is announced as the church's next minister. So the host grows very close to the candidate, and they have a lot of phone conversations, a lot of email conversations back and forth. When the host reaches out to the candidate, and this is something that's very unique to IMP's approach. When the host reaches out to the candidate, I am so-and-so from the Pittman Road Church of Christ in Sewell, New Jersey, and we are looking for our next preaching minister. I'm just reaching out to you to tell you a little bit about our church, and what I would like to ask you to do for the next week is just to pray. Just pray. And see if God puts any kind of a burden at all on your heart to talk with us more. And so you set a time for a follow-up conversation, the host does, and then reaches out to the preaching minister after that time has passed, and you say, okay, you've had a time to pray. We've had some time to pray. Is God telling you that this may be a conversation that we might want to continue in? And that's when you can really start getting then into the nuts and bolts of the dialogue. We have had ministers who have gone through this process say, can't tell you how many churches I've been contacted by over the years. I don't think I was ever asked to pray about it. And so one of the things that this does for candidates is it's very refreshing and it's very encouraging that before this is anything else, this is about seeking God's will in the process. And so the host walks very, very closely with that candidate. The host may even say, hey, before we hang up, would you be comfortable if I shared a prayer with you? And that's a really, really cool thing as well. We finalize the ideal candidate description, and I'll show you a cover of what that looks like here in just a bit. We finalize vision and mission as it relates to candidates, the specific skill sets that we're looking for, the competencies that we're looking for, the minimum requirements, the preferred requirements, and we develop what we call a position profile and a candidate package. And this is a digital packet that you are actually able to mail out to your candidates that showcases not just the church, but also the community. You kind of have the luxury here. NFL fan? ? Hockey fan? ? So you've got some quality of life things that you can market here that a lot of other places may not be able to necessarily showcase. So we begin with this inquiry phase, and that moves to the identification phase, which then leads to the interview phase. And that's the next piece. And each one of these phases has a question. And so the interview phase is, who are these candidates? We've identified them. We've had some initial contact with them. We've had some phone conversations. The process now leads to pairing committee members with a candidate. And so the initial host contacts the candidate. They request the season of prayer. They will exchange contact information. They will make a commitment to confidentiality. We will protect your confidentiality during this process. We will send the position profile. We will send the candidate package. If through that interaction, the host feels like in his heart or in her heart, oh boy, This is a guy we got to keep talking to. I'm so excited because I think I see something here that as I think about our future, I could get really, really fired up about. If the host really believes that this is a person that we need to move forward with, then the host works with the committee to form what's called a triad. And so that triad, now we have 3 people who basically go back and do with the candidate the same thing the host just did. And so there's another round of vetting. And now we've got a triad of people who are listening to sermons, and they're talking to recommenders, and they're engaging with the candidate. We might have our first video interview at this particular phase of the journey, okay, as you're talking one-on-one with this candidate. If the triad is in agreement, oh my goodness, God's doing something amazing here. This person is incredible. I can just see us having such an amazing future in partnership and ministry with this individual. Then the triad makes the recommendation to the full committee. And at that point, the full committee does the same thing that the host just did and that the triad just did. So you see, at this level, we've got 3 rounds of vetting a candidate. 3 sets of interview notes. And the host level is really not an interview. That's just more of a getting to know you. But you should be hearing consistency in the dialogue. You should be hearing congruence in the dialogue that you've had with this candidate. And ultimately, if the committee is in agreement, then we move from there to invitation. And you'll see here, as we go through this vetting process, do we want to bring these individuals here? And who are we ultimately going to recommend to our elders? And so the next phase is the invitation phase. And the key question here is, does the candidate align with the elders' vision, the mission, and the values? And so at this point, the baton passes on to the elders. They pray over the recommended candidate. They're going to schedule conversations, an interview time. They're going to build relationships here. And at this point, they either accept the recommendation and they extend the invitation to welcome the candidate formally, or they reject the committee's recommendation. And they say, hey, we're seeing something here in these early conversations that we're not comfortable with, so we need you guys to go back and bring us somebody else. The church ultimately is invited to interact with the candidate, engage in communal discernment. Some churches do that in a weekend. Some use a week. Some do 2 weeks. It just kind of depends on the nature of the church and how you make decisions. And then if everybody's feedback is in agreement, the candidate is ultimately called, and we reach a formal agreement at that point. Or the elders reject the recommendation, or the candidate declines, and the committee brings in another recommendation. So that's the invitation phase. And then we can move into future care. How do we help our new minister hit the ground quickly and prepare for a long tenure? Again, the elders are primarily leading the charge on this, but the committee plays a good role here too, because the committee is going to have formed some friendships with this individual already. A lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, a lot of prayers. So you're going to be the ones championing this new guy above all others. We reach a polity model agreement, how we're going to decide. We finalize the job description. We start building relationships with strategic people in the church. We schedule a 30-day evaluation, a 60-day evaluation, a 90-day evaluation. And it's not probation, right? It's just really kind of monitoring how are we doing, and then schedule and define ultimately the annual evaluation. So I know you feel like you've been drinking from a fire hydrant, but do you see the extreme vetting that takes place and how we're crossing T's and dotting I's? It's a very, very thorough process. Questions about the timeline or the search process itself? Yeah, are you tired already? You're not even serving on the committee yet? Yeah. Anybody can hire a preacher. Any church can hire a preacher.
Jay, did you have a question?
And I know it sounds like, and it looks like, oh my goodness, this is going to take, I won't have a life for 6 months. That's not true. That's not true. When you get into the committee meetings, they normally last about an hour to an hour and a half. So most committees on the front end will visit about once a week. And then that starts to taper because you've got to have some time to reach out to candidates, to gather information and come back. So after you meet those first 5, 6, 7 weeks, then you move to more of a cycle that's about every other week. And that generally then remains the norm for the rest of the search. Okay? So I don't want you to look at this and think, I'm going to have to not see my wife and children for 8 months. That's not going to be it at all. Okay? Or I'm not going to be able to see my husband and children. That's not it. But it is intensive. It's a lot of work.
So which category, in your experience, is the one that can go on for the longest, like additional time that you didn't anticipate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably the identification phase is one of the ones that can be the most challenging because it just depends on the number of candidates that our recommenders give us. So sometimes we have to cast a broader net, for sure. In unhealthy churches, the pre-work takes the longest because it's very, very difficult for churches to sometimes get shaken out of existing patterns. But in healthy churches, the elders are able to move through that pretty quickly. Yeah, good question. Very good question. A couple of other things, if we'll go to the next slide. How do we identify an ideal candidate? Do we want are we looking for a prophet, a pastor, or a priest? What are their primary spiritual gifts? What personal characteristics are we looking for? What leadership style? What preaching style? What skills? What competencies? What experiences? What theology? All of this, the church helps us define this. Yeah, are we clicking? Are we able to click? Oh, no worries. So as we go through this, all of this, the congregation helps us define this, actually. And the church gives feedback primarily through the comprehensive survey. So you will hear the church say, as I'm looking out at our future, this is what I believe we need in our next preaching minister. These are the characteristics. These are the strengths that we look at. You can see some articles that are listed in the middle of page 13. Some particular questions that you're going to have to process as a church. Are we looking for an internal candidate? Are we looking for someone outside? Are we looking for some type of a hybrid? Those are questions the leadership's going to have to wrestle with. We're going to have heart-to-heart about commitment to the process, not just with the committee, but with the entire church. And so, church, we're going to need you to be committed to this, to trust the committee, to trust the elders, to trust the time that we're spending in dialogue and see what the Lord does with that. I've given you several appendices to read through, and this showcases what a search committee covenant looks like on pages 14, 15, and 16. Appendix B is a search committee charge. Generally, this is done in front of the body, that the committee members are brought up on a Sunday morning, and they are charged before the congregation. The way that this is played out is very, very visible, and it's very, very vocal, and gives us as a church opportunity to see this blessing take place firsthand. Okay, I know that's a lot. That's a whole lot, and I hope I haven't scared you to death. But this intense framework, it's like a refining process. And as the dross burns off, you ultimately get this wonderfully refined gold, this precious, precious end result that God can use in a very powerful way. Our approach has a fantastic track record. There are 2 churches that I know of who went through this process, and their minister left only after being there about 3 years. All the other churches that we have worked with, the ministers that we've placed are still on staff. And so, because it is so thorough, you're just not leaving a lot open for chance. And maybe this is the right guy. You're going to be able to know confidently this is the guy. If you choose to partner with us, there's some levels of service. We have full service where we come in and work with the eldership and with the leadership team, so that would be eldership and staff, with the search committee, and that involves a minister, actually the consultant, flying in and being with you 3 Sundays a month And so it's very intense, a lot of meetings on the front end, and that, again, begins to taper over time. If we do a limited search option, we drop in about once a month. The framework is still the same, but the church is doing most of the work. The consultant is really more in just an advisory role, kind of keeping you in between the ditches, okay? And then there's some other options where we might parachute drop in about once every 2 to 3 months, and we're doing a lot of work via telephone and that kind of stuff. That's up to the elders to decide. We don't push one over the other. It's really for the elders to decide and to discern. And we also don't push ourselves as an organization. Mission Resource Network does some of this kind of work. Mission Alive does some of this kind of work. Stan Granberg and his organization does some of this kind of work. So Interim Ministry Partners isn't the only game in town. I would encourage you, look around, explore. But what I wouldn't encourage you to do is to pull out from the dock without a pretty intensive framework in place, because that just gives you the ability to kind of have a pinball machine approach, and that just wears a church out. But if you're purposeful about figuring out who you are and where you're going and how you're going to get there, and then going out and finding the candidate whose head and heart aligns with that, I just think it puts you in a really, really good position to do some pretty awesome stuff for the Lord. Okay? So what questions do you have? What observations do you have? And then we'll wrap up.
Mine is more of a comment than a question. Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
My comment is, as long as I've been in churches and church ministry, which is over 40 years, I have never felt good about the approach that we used to use, which is what you described, the preacher parade, where we'd look at a bunch of resumes, where we'd get 50 or 75 resumes, and then we'd have the preacher parade.
Yeah.
And I've thought and I've said, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. And I think you've got a better way.
Thank you.
And I'm thrilled that Tim and whoever else was involved in the organization of this process. Number one, that it was conceived, and number two, that you've got a 10-year track record. So just my full endorsement and encouragement to continue, and I'm happy for this for our church.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to hear. And it's fascinating, the world that we live in, because we live in such truth is relative kind of dynamic these days. So this was a youth minister, this happened about 5 years ago, was hired by a church. This young man created a Gmail account using his professor's name and gave the church that he was interviewing that individual as a reference using a fake email account. So he became his own reference. And the church just thought, oh, wow, he's got this guy's endorsement. He should be a really good candidate. So they actually brought him in for an interview, and they hired him. So I don't think that's going to happen to you, but it's kind of just what a wacky world we live in, right? What a crazy world we live in. So yeah, we're getting a little bit better, hopefully, at being a little better at vetting our people. What else? What are the thoughts, observations? Yes, ma'am.
So we probably need more than one minister,
Okay.
actually. And I don't know exactly what
Yeah.
those role descriptions will look like and
Yeah.
how that will pan out. But looking at
Yeah.
at the staff that we have today and long-term future of the church.
Sure.
So this plan really lays out the search for one. But what if the evaluation phase determines 2 role descriptions?
Sure.
Do you have recommendations on how we approach that?
Absolutely. It's just about your desired outcomes. Where does this church want to be? What's it going to take to get you there? So whether it's 1 person, 2, 3, 5, it doesn't, whatever it is, then that's how you design this. So like in your position profile, for example, if you're hiring a preaching minister, you would also designate, we are simultaneously looking for. So like I work with the Providence Road Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, when Jeff Wilding left and moved back to California, and they put in their position profile, candidates we are considering should also be aware that we are actively searching for a worship minister. And they said, ideally, we would like for the individual to be able to speak life to that position as well.
And so just like, I guess, corporate hiring, you wouldn't want to modify the role description based on the person that you find. You want to identify those separate descriptions,
Surely.
again, hypothetically,
Absolutely, yeah.
in
Yeah.
advance and look for that specific role.
But there could be a timeline that you're looking at. So, for example, if you're, and it's all contextual, but if you're thinking kind of more senior minister, then you may want to say, okay, we're going to create a chronology to this on purpose. We want to get our senior ministry here first, and then we want to make sure that we find somebody who can definitely work with this individual, right, and complement the skill sets versus getting, heads that butt together and that kind of thing.
Right. But we probably want to be planning for that.
Yeah, surely, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
If we do partner with you, is it possible to get references from the churches you've already worked with?
Absolutely, yes.
And the other question is, what is the most common mistake churches make during this process?
Wow, great question. Great question. The most common mistake that churches make in the process, getting ahead of God, is probably the one that I've seen the most. So a committee starts to get really, really excited about a candidate, and they go to the elders and they say, hey, we think we found our guy. And the elders go, oh, that's so great. Can we get him here in 2 weeks? And so it's kind of like, okay, breathe deeply, calm down. Let's wait on the Lord, and let's really, really make sure that we're doing this right. So I've seen that happen some. I've seen some people on committees get a little territorial sometimes. And so that can also be a mistake that folks make. But again, a strong chairperson is key. Your chairperson has got to be really a great communicator, great organizer, high level of trust. So those are some of the ways that we can push through those. Yeah, for sure. What else? Okay, so a couple things. I'm going to go, we're heading back over to Garth's house, I think. A couple of us just for some kind of wrapping up kind of stuff and some prayer and processing. The survey results will be shared, and Dan, I sent Garth a digital copy of that. So if you want to distribute that to staff and that kind of thing, you guys can just negotiate whatever that looks like for you all. I think you're going to be so encouraged as a church when you see the results of the survey. I was just really encouraged. I think you will be as well. So next steps will be just kind of prayerful discernment for the leaders to think about, kind of what this looks like and maybe what a timeline looks like. I hope this has been helpful for you. I hope that if nothing else, when you think about, the result of the time that we've spent together this weekend has changed the trajectory of your church forever. And my prayer is that it's changing it in a very positive way, that you're going to be asking some hard questions. You're going to be really, really honest and open with each other. The elders are going to be in a season of discernment and prayer, and that's just going to make them stronger. And that as you think about your future, identifying what it's going to take to get where you want to be, God's just going to do some really, really good stuff with that. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this pans out. If you go full service option, kind of depending on how you go, really, my hunch is that I would not be the person that would partner with you on the consulting side just because of my relationship with my church. I don't have that much time to be able to do the full service consulting. But all of the guys that are involved in this are just top shelf. They're just amazing, amazing people. So we don't do duds. We have a dud-free policy in our organization. So, elders, anything y'all want to say? Staff, anything y'all want to say before we wrap up? Surely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, maybe some of you are thinking, wow, I got a lot more than what I bargained for this morning. But the elders want to thank every one of you for being here. It was not by just chance or, wow, this would be good to invite this person that you're here. You're here because we specifically wanted you to be here. And I just want to thank Greg for coming here. Let's give him a hand.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.
And also, too, as we were going through this, I couldn't help but thinking about Dan and looking at this chart and how Dan has lived through with this church, has overseen growth and maturity and maintaining and mentoring. And I just want to give Dan a hand here, all of us. And again, thank you. Thank all of you for being here. We've got a lot to think about. And what I want you to do, each one of you, is I want you to share some of the things that as you're talking amongst yourselves, I want you to share this with others, other members, other family members of your families, and share this with your spouses and your friends, whoever, okay, in the church, of what, we talked about this morning, what we experienced here, and what Greg shared with us, just your thoughts. And I want you to know that as I speak for the eldership here, that we are listening. We're listening. We're not here to tell you this is what, you need to do. We're listening, and we're listening to you. What that means is we want to hear from you. Okay? Want to hear from you, more of your perspective in this. And so with that said, we're going to have lunch, the elders that are here, have lunch with Greg, and we're going to sort of kind of just wrap up a little bit here and send Greg on his way. But let's have a prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this, for Greg and for the things that he's shared here this morning. Thank you for the wisdom that you have blessed Greg and his partners in this ministry, and we just pray that we can have a biblical approach to this, that we can humble our hearts before you, and that we can just allow you to work in this process, in this season of transition, Father. We pray that we as a congregation, those represented here, Father, we pray that you will give us an understanding of the seriousness of this task and what we need to do in order to help our body here to grow, if we need to reinvent, to realign, to refocus, Father. We ask for your help. And it's through your Son, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.